What happens when we dream? Are these just byproducts of brain activity, just random visuals that you're getting? Or are they more meaningful projections of the unconscious?
This is far from like a settled question.
It's not?
But I can give you my account.
Okay.
We associate that ego with the psyche as a whole. And Jung disagrees with that. Aspects of the ego that the ego itself does not accept. So these are hidden even from the ego to a great extent. And this is what we call the shadow. If you think about love at first sight, if you met somebody and you have very little information, dreams are another good example of this. The people that you talk to in the environments that you navigate in a dream, well, what's generating those? Where are they coming from? In a sense, you are not alone in here. You shouldn't muck around and like blow the lid off your unconscious when you're not ready. And that's what psychedelics do. And to me, that is like a really culturally myopic view. People will say it was more real than this world, right? Realer than this. And like, oh, you don't understand. This is the shadow image world, right?
This is a conversation with Anderson Todd. He's a registered psychotherapist and a professor at the University of Toronto, specializing in cognitive science, Neo-Jungian theory, and consciousness. In this conversation, he provides a Jungian Theory 101 masterclass. What is Carl Jung's model of the psyche? What is the self? What is the ego? What is the shadow? What is the collective unconscious? How is it different from Sigmund Freud's work? What happens when you move the ego away from the center? We explore his journey into these topics and his research on altered states of consciousness. Is it essential to push your brain into these altered states to actually explore its extremes, the boundaries of cognition? Is it essential to take a psychedelic? What happens when we take a psychedelic? What happens when we dream? What does it do to the brain? These are such fascinating topics. I love these type of conversations. We also explore alchemy, not the transformation you're thinking of. We also explore magic, not the magic spells that you're thinking of, and Carl Jung's idea of synchronicity. These are the type of conversations that I want to have. 1-2 hour discussions about the laws of nature, quantum computing, cognitive science, Jungian psychology, geopolitics, journalism, rationality. This is my idea of a raging Friday night, but this is not what the algorithm thinks is exciting. If I really want to just create a channel that gets a lot of views, I should be making meme videos or compilations or making dance videos. But I do think these conversations are of value, but this model is not sustainable. The algorithm will never push it. So if you really want this project to continue, you can either consider making a donation, buy super thanks, become a Patreon donor, or you can just share these episodes, because these external links and clicks and shares, they really help videos push past those barriers that are set by the algorithm that looks at a 2-hour discussion about Jungian psychology and doesn't consider it exciting enough for the layman. So if you like this episode, only if you like it by the end of this episode, please consider sharing it around. And now, it's no time.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
Carl Jung, you might have heard of this name, had once said, I realize that under the circumstances you have described, you feel the need to see clearly, but your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Without, everything seems discordant. Only within does it coalesce into unity. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. When you were growing up, Carl Jung was everywhere. He was in the album cover for the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album. He was in the music of David Bowie. He was one of the inspirations for Ziggy Stardust, music of the Police. Now he's in the music of the Korean band BTS. He's been in the work of Hermann Hesse, in the paintings of Jackson Pollock. He was everywhere. So you decided to give him a try. And at the age of 13, I think you started reading his books. And you said, when you started out, it was quite difficult. It was like wading through mud. But very quickly, you realized that you were landing upon a jewel every few pages. So I want to start by introducing some of Carl Jung's core ideas. I have a picture here of his Jungian model, and I would love it if you can break it down for me. What is the Jungian model of the psyche?
It's interesting because you have a diagram here, and Jung himself was quite cautious about reifying any specific kind of diagram or map, right? The idea was that in some sense, you could get the relationships of the psyche and there were ways of expressing them, but you shouldn't get too attached. You shouldn't eat the menu, right? Or treat the map as the territory. So there were several different representations. But in this case with this diagram, this is really foregrounding the big difference between Jungian depth psychology and something like Freudian psychoanalysis. And the big difference that you'll see if you look at the diagram is that the ego, which is to say the component of our psyche that is the conscious part of us that we identify with, right? The inner I that we think, yes, I am me, and this is my interiority, right? We associate that ego with the psyche as a whole. And the general assumption that we have is that the ego is the real game, that here what we experience as ourselves is the center of the psyche, right? In some sense. And Jung disagrees with that. He ends up having his breakup with Freud, which we'll probably talk about at some point, but the bromance ends. And a big part of this is that Jung wants to shift away from the ego as being at the very center of the psyche. And instead, he wants to stand or gesture towards a different center to the psyche, a center to both the conscious and unconscious mind that was much vaster and organized by something that is not, strictly speaking, part of the ego. So in that sense, this diagram is getting at that very clearly, right? The self is at the center of this, with the ego outside of it, in orbit around it, even though that is not our customary experience. Just by way of reference to Freud, because it's a model that people tend to be familiar with. But Freud is relatively sort of hydraulic, okay? And when I say that, what I mean is that there's a system of pressures, in a sense, which are operating. The ego is in the center. The superego is attempting to pull people towards pro-social sort of goals. So it's pulling up, in some sense, up figuratively, on the ego, and the id is pulling down on the ego. And the id represents the animal, the instinctual, right? And in some sense, the antisocial. And so Freud conceives, initially speaking, of the ego as being in this tug of war, this hydraulic tug of war between these sort of two principles. Their breakup really happens, in 1913, when Jung starts playing with the idea that there might be other centers of activity in the psyche, things other than just the sex drive, the libido, right, which was what Freud was focused with, and that, in fact, the ego might not be at the center at all. So this diagram does a reasonably good job of portraying certain aspects of that. But again, with the caveat, don't eat the menu, don't mistake the map for the territory. It's just a way of talking about the relationships of something that aren't necessarily spatialized in this sense. But what do we have? So let's start from the familiar. So the familiar would be the ego. This is our more or less everyday experience, and it's our sense of self-identity, right? That differs from the persona. The persona is the mask we wear. It's our social interface. So an easy way to think about this, right, is to think about the role of clothing. Clothing is to some extent mandated for you socially, right? By and large, we're not allowed to walk around unclothed, right? We must wear clothing. It's sort of mandated in most circumstances. The sort of clothing that we wear is also mandated in lots of ways, right? There may be gender mandates. There may be age mandates. There are situational mandates, right? You wear certain things in certain occasions. I once wore combat boots to a funeral because they were the only pair of shoes that I had. And that was not well received, right? I had broken a rule in a certain sense. On top of that, however, there's also the aspect of clothing, for instance, right? That it reveals and conceals. It's used to cover us up, and that's mandated. And in certain roles, like being a judge, there's very specific. You must wear the robes or something of this kind, a police officer. But also, we get to make individual decisions about it. We decide what aspects of ourselves we want to express in our clothing. We attempt to convey something of ourselves to people, but it's selective necessarily. So the persona, right, if you think about it more broadly, is this mask we wear. It's all the things that we're willing to present outwards to others. And some of that is constructed, is imposed on us by sort of cultural convention, right, or expectation. And some of it is individualized, personalized. So the persona in general is the personality that we have outwards. And I think that it's, generally speaking, it's a mistake to think of it in the singular as a persona. Properly speaking, it's personae, because we wear a lot of different masks. It is a rare and probably not necessarily functional behavior to take the same kind of persona stance with your grandmother as you do with your romantic partner or your boss, right? So we have a set of masks that we wear. We have a mask that is fitted to our parents and a mask that is fitted to our friends, a mask that is fitted to work. But ultimately speaking, all of those personae, all of those masks are both selectively revealing things about us that we choose, but also concealing things, holding things back about ourselves, because of course, nobody or virtually nobody is sort of transparently disclosive about themselves. They have private inner thoughts, right? Okay. So we have the customary consciousness, the ego in the middle. Interfacing with sort of the social world, the outside world, we have the persona, right? And the outer world beyond that. But the idea in Jung is that there is a comparable set of layers which sort of extend into the unconscious more deeply. So one is aspects of the ego that the ego itself does not accept. So these are hidden even from the ego to a great extent. And this is what we call the shadow. The shadow is representative of all of the possibilities of personality and actualities of personality and behavior that the ego hides, that we ourselves hide from ourselves. So they may be things that we have discarded. For instance, during development, we're often forced into a false binary, a set of choice. So the classic version of this is you get a kid who at the age of, say, 8, really enjoys drawing, right? They love drawing. And the parent comes up and basically crushes this and says, you're wasting your time. There's no money in that. You need to practice school. You should become an accountant. Nothing wrong with being an accountant if that's where it soars. In some cases, that becomes, sort of crumpled, thrown in the garbage and forgotten about. The person just never again reconnects to it. In some cases, it becomes straight up like demonized, right? So the person then associates that negatively. So if they were to then later in their life encounter an artist, they have this powerful reaction about, whatever, that's useless or, right? An outsized emotional response. So because of that, it can also become the well from which new potentials are drawn, or that is, old potentials are drawn. This is the so-called kind of golden shadow. So the roads that we haven't taken sometimes can inform the personality. That person, if they say, felt stagnant at the age of 35, might be able to reach backwards into their past, make a recollection of this, and find that reconnecting with this piece of themselves that had been thrown away, the artist piece, right, that was sort of thrown away, allows them to re-enter a state of flourishing or creative expansion. That's the golden shadow. That's the part everybody likes to talk about. But the other parts of the shadow, or the other aspects of the shadow, are that it also contains all of the things that you are and have done, but that you do not want to reckon with. So this is what I occasionally refer to as like the 2 a.m. looking in the mirror moment where, you suddenly come face to face with something, in a very stark way, with something from your past, something you've done, maybe somebody that you've hurt or something you've done wrong. Like you have a sort of a moral confrontation with yourself, right? And the thing about those, in my experience, is that they tend to be quite slippery. They evade your attention, okay? And this is sort of central to actually Jung's conception of things. Beyond that, in the shadow, of course, is also the potentials that we have in ourselves as human beings that are not necessarily expressed, but could be, and some of which are very, very dark. So, in some ways, this is shorthanded as a kind of like, under the right circumstances, you too could be a fascist, right? Is typically how that gets phrased. And I would say that the replication around a lot of that data from the 70s is mixed, but the basics of it are still there. There is a degree of universal commonality. There's a certain amount of shared psychic structure between humans. That's a given. And there are aspects of the human potential and human behavior that fall into the shadow because, as a species, we are capable demonstratively of atrocity. And so that capacity also exists and has to be reckoned with in the kind of deep collective shadow. Okay, so when Jung is talking about this exploration of the psyche, and we can get into that more, but he sort of roughly has it categorized in stages. And so doing shadow work is often the first component of the work because, in a sense, the shadow is literally the shadow of the ego. It's close to the ego. It is in some sense attached to the feet of the ego, right? That's why it wells up at 2 a.m. That's why it's relatively close. And detecting it is often indirect, right? It's slippery. It tends to not hold in your mind. Even when you grab it by the tail, something comes and reasserts, and your inner narrative reasserts, and you tend to disregard that. So making confrontations with it, but then successfully sort of folding those realizations back into the ego is a big part of what's involved in what Jung called shadow work. Encountering these potentials within oneself, but successfully folding them back rather than sort of insisting them, right? Or segregating them away from consciousness. After one is doing this work for a little bit, inner work, you tend to then get into what Jung saw as deeper layers of the unconscious, And if there is a kind of analog, if the persona is the interface point, the mask is the interface point to the outer world, then there's an interface point to the deeper inner world also, which Jung calls, as a mouthful, the contrasexual soul image. But it would be more familiar to people as this idea of the anima and the animus. And the idea there is that, again, this is a kind of human potential. So the idea is that everybody, in a sense, has both, say, the male and female potential within their psyche. But if the male potential is actualized, right? If they're born male and they're told they're male and the male structures are put on their persona, then correspondingly, their inner component, their anima, is going to take on feminine attributes. It's going to take on a feminine quality. And the same is true. So men, in that sense, according to Jung, have a kind of inner female soul, and women have an inner male soul, the animus. So there's this sort of corresponding. He links this to a few things. I think probably the most familiar one for most people would be the experience of love at first sight, if you've encountered this, or very rapid romantic projection. So the idea with, if you think about love at first sight, if you've ever had this experience, it's like you've met somebody and you have very little information. Like, they're probably physically attractive to you. That's usually a pretty strong feature. But otherwise, you don't know much. You just haven't interacted with them much. And yet you feel this incredibly strong, powerful, determining kind of emotion. And the point is that you can't be reacting to the actual person. You simply don't know them. If you've spent the night even wandering around the city until 5 a.m., talking endlessly and whatever, which is the kind of thing people do, yeah, you have some information, but probably not enough to justify the sorts of feelings and images and senses of potential that you're having with that person, right? So that is projective, okay? It's a case where it's projective. The corresponding thing in the shadow would be basically hate at first sight. When you meet somebody and you cannot stand them, right? They twist in your guts for some reason. Either one of those things, you can learn to withdraw the projection, which is to say, if you get to a place where you realize, wait, this isn't about them, this is a piece of me that's sort of draping onto them in my psyche and causing me to experience in this way, you can withdraw that thing. And that, of course, in theory, is enabling you to have a more direct and authentic encounter, right, with those people, but also to thereby learn about which factors you are bringing to bear in this, right? That is, your reality is constructed in that sense. And there are these autonomous portions of your psyche which are constellating things, setting things up, infusing things with meaning and potential, but outside your ego, operating outside. So in some way, the anima and the animus end up often as a sort of guide figure. And the ultimate centralizing figure within the Jungian account is the self, as distinct from the ego. The self, in a sense, is the organizing principle of the psyche for Jung. And that, what that means is tricky, right? You could have an organizing principle like the center of gravity. Okay, the center of gravity in an object is not a thing. It's not it's not something you can't cut the center of gravity out and then, right? It's a mathematical abstraction. It's a feature about the way that gravity of the body as a whole attracts to the center. Likewise, in a dynamical system, you might have an attractor state, which again isn't a thing, but there's a kind of state space that something orbits around as it's organized, right, in the creation. So it seems to me that in many ways what Jung is talking about, and this probably links to some of the reasons why I think actually he is a predecessor of sort of cognitive science in a bunch of ways. But the idea that the self is in some way the organizing principle or center of the overall self-organizing system, in which the ego is actually a very small component, that the rest of the psyche outside your normal ego consciousness is actually orbiting, in some sense, the self, not the ego, that you are not the center of your own world in that sense. Does that track so far?
Yeah, so far so good.
Yeah. So one of the analogies that I like to use here is that, in a sense, this is like the shift from a geocentric model of the solar system to a heliocentric model. So, when we believed the geocentric model, it seemed as though the sun rose in the east and set in the west, right? And it seemed as though the planets followed these erratic paths that couldn't be kind of modeled regularly like other stars, right? Literally, they were sort of wandering. We tried to do a lot of mathematics and mechanical, building of orreries and stuff to model this, and it turns out it was incredibly difficult. We kept having to amend with epicycles until Copernicus, who certainly didn't originate this idea, but he sort of pushed it forward, addressed this and said, well, if you pretend that the sun is at the center, the math is easier. If you pretend the sun is at the center, he didn't go so far as to say it was. Galileo comes along and says, no, it is at the center. And this was not unknown to the church anyway. That's a sideline, but they already knew it. It was the Pythagorean heresy. And anyway, it was well known. So similarly, we are used to operating from within the ego, our standard consciousness. And from that perspective, it seems as though we look up and there is a certain amount of regularity in our psychic life, but there are also factors that are unpredictable that we seem not to be able to model, whether it's in our emotions, our responses, our ideas about things, the various ways in which we are surprised by our own behavior and by the contents of our psyche, or thwarted by it, where we feel that we have resistance in various ways. And Jung's sort of mode was to say, the math is easier, in a sense, if you treat the self as the center. So if you shift your perspective and you think about the psyche as a bunch of components, including the ego, which are in orbit around the self, that the self is really at the center of the system, all of a sudden things become much more predictable in some sense. That's an analogy, but nevertheless, I think it's a somewhat fruitful one. Now, importantly, the fact that you are treating the sun as the center of the solar system doesn't mean that you go live on the sun, right? That's a bad idea. You just get destroyed. And similarly, within the Jungian system, it's not that you want to migrate into the self. You wouldn't want to be the self. It simply wouldn't work. It would overwhelm your ego. This is a state that is typically called inflation, because the mode of the self, the way that the self presents, and this is important, is within Jung's conception is functionally indistinguishable from divine. So there's an epistemological point here, which is that we can't really definitively prove the existence or non-existence of God. It's not clear what evidence would be able to answer that question. However, Jung points out that when people have encounters with what seem to be these deeper structures within their psyche, like the self, the way that those things show up for them is often coded seemingly in the symbolism, language, imagery, felt phenomenology, etc., of what we would normally think of as religious experience or mystical experience. So in that sense, what Jung is proposing is interestingly radical, because he's saying you can be a radical agnostic about the actual metaphysical existence of the divine, but you still have to deal with the divine within yourself, which is to say that there seem to be aspects of it which are baked into our very nature. And if you are not in dialogue in some sense with these other components, you will feel lost. So when he says in that quote that you used, right, that if you want to get a hold of things, you need to look in, that if you spend all of your time fixated on the outer world, you are missing the interior dynamics or taking them for granted. And you therefore can't come to any understanding of why you are behaving the way you behave. And so, right, that stymies. I mean, people do engage with the world without doing that, but it tends to create problems for them. If instead you do this sort of iterative engagement with the outside world, attempt to pull on your projections, getting a sense of what the difference is and therefore what you're bringing to it. You get what he didn't call, but in cognitive science, they would call a notice invariance heuristic. Okay. So notice invariance heuristic is like you have several instances of something and you try to look for what doesn't change, right? What is invariant.
Okay.
You can think about this in simple terms as being like, when somebody has that thing, a friend of you says, I just dated another person and they were exactly like the last two people that I dated. I thought they were different, but they were exactly the same. Okay, what accounts for this in some sense? There's lots of things that might, but the idea is if you're seeing that kind of regularity and it's inexplicable to you, a notice invariance heuristic tells you that maybe that's a you thing. The short version of this would be the like, if you encounter one asshole, can I swear?
Yeah, why not?
Okay, just checking.
Yeah, go for it.
So if you encounter one asshole in a day, he's probably an asshole. And if you encounter two assholes in a day, yeah, okay, it's a bad asshole day. If you encounter 3 or more assholes in one day, you should probably stop and reflect if the assholery might be coming from you, right? Whether or not you're interpreting people as assholes uncharitably, or whether or not you yourself are being an asshole and bringing that behavior out, right?
Right.
So that's a notice invariance heuristic. Jung basically says the same thing in this respect. When you're attempting to track your inner life, you are engaged in this back and forth where you're dealing with exterior objects, right? Dealing with the world and so on and so forth. But you're also attempting to tease out at some level what the aspects of your inner life are bringing to that. But then also shifting into the inner life and attempting to have a more direct encounter with those dynamics within yourself, which seem to operate in a autonomous or seemingly autonomous or semi-autonomous. They seem to operate according to their own rules. And I'm inclined to say that it's actually even stronger than that. There's good evidence that they are, in some sense, literally small personalities of a sort. There's actually multiple people in a way living in your head. So this is sort of the basics, in a sense, of the Jungian model. It's this interplay between, working to the outside, but then pulling back occasionally, in a sense, isolating the external referent so that you can pay attention to internal dynamics and then iterating it. So it's in and out and in and out and in and out. And thereby, you are both theoretically improving your conditions in the outside world, but you're also gradually sorting out these unconscious tensions, distinctions, pieces of you that are working at cross purposes. You're trying to sort of bring the whole community into a relatively harmonious functioning in some sense. And to do that, you have to take them seriously, engage with them seriously. So much of the work is about, methods that one might use to do so.
I think this is a fantastic introduction into the model, and we definitely want to dive deeper into all these elements of the model and also some of the methods that you just mentioned. Before we do that, I have to take a quick digression and talk about your journey getting to this point. You've said that instead of a checkered career, you've had one full of polka dots. You've had a variety of interests, creative interests when you were young. Of course, you loved reading. But then when you were quite young, you also tried to create a machine using magnets that could alter states of consciousness.
Oh gosh, I talked about that online. Okay, yes.
Yeah. Let's face it, we've all done it.
Okay, sure.
And you've constantly said that school was a train wreck. You always felt like the adults didn't feel like they were in charge. So you dropped out of high school, went traveling across the world, explored spirituality, wrote a novel. And it wasn't until a near apocalyptic event with the psychedelic that you decided it's time to leave my cave and re-enter civilization. So take me back to this journey. Why do you think you gravitated towards all these different creative interests? If you can look within younger Anderson's self with a capital S, why do you think all of these disciplines were so attractive?
So I probably can't look into younger Anderson's self, but I have some sense of continuity with younger Anderson's ego at any rate, and persona. Right. So yeah, I mean, this is always it's always an interesting question. I do have, it seems to me, in talking to people, a higher degree of autobiographical continuity than many other people. I remember my childhood. And I speak to a lot of people, a surprising number of people to me, who don't. They have no recollection, really, of childhood before a certain point in time. A dear friend of mine he claimed anyway, to remember nothing prior to his bar mitzvah. So
Really?
13 and back, a blank spot for him, right?
Wow.
Yeah, surprising. But not entirely uncommon, I think. And to some extent evidenced in adult interactions. When I watch adults interact with children, very often I'm befuddled by the way in which they interact, because they don't, it seems like they don't remember being a child and therefore don't remember what children care about or how to interact with them. And furthermore, they tend to discount their inner states. So the classic example of this that gets my back up is when adults have a 13-year-old kid or something, right? And the kid, has a crush, and they write this off as puppy love.
Right.
So here the kid is like freaking out or bawling their eyes out, or oh my God, right? And the parents are like, ugh. And to me, this represents like a profound failure of memory and empathy, because I remember what those things were like. And the answer was, it was just as intense as later, if not more intense, because the jello has not yet set in your brain. Your self-regulation is not yet in place. You've never done it before. You get, frankly, bad advice, right? People have bad advice. Culture has terrible advice. So this idea of just sort of writing it off because people are younger is quite widespread, right? That discount. It's like, you're younger. You don't know. And it's like, no, people are still having experiences. They just have fewer resources to deal with them when they're young. So that probably frames my childhood pretty well. I was, I was a precocious kid. I read very early. I'm told I used to recite the alphabet and numbers and stuff before I spoke. And my family occasionally does like to joke that I didn't speak until I was, older than 2. But once I started, I never stopped. So it's, I've made up for lost time in some ways. I had a range of interests as a kid, and I was very interested in fantasy. I got into role-playing games quite early, quite young, like 3 or 4. Those informed a lot. I had open access to media. So my parents were very liberal about what sorts of media I was allowed to consume. And so I grew up on science fiction movies and horror movies, stuff that was R-rated, things that my friends were not allowed to watch. My parents were both bright and had a background. My father worked in psychiatric, in psychiatry, did crisis intervention. My mother was an ICU nurse. So it was an educated household with a lot of books and a lot of science fiction books, and I read voraciously. Yeah, the sort of falling out in some sense with the adult world around 12, right, was as a consequence of a bunch of things. I was coming into age. I had, I think, my first really serious depressive episode and did not yet have any framework for that. Again, right, like puppy love, this was a puppy despair, except I had literally no framework, nothing to whatever. When I was a little older, it was okay. My father was depressive too, and he was very supportive of that. But when I was younger, I didn't even quite know to address it with anybody. But one of the things that came out of that was I began to have a much more distanced sense. And in watching the adult world, I kind of just concluded that it was non-functional. So that it seemed to me that adults at large were dealing with the same kinds of erratic, unknown behaviors and addictions, compulsions, conflict. They didn't seem especially in control to me. And the answers that were sort of given around that didn't seem like very good answers, the implicit explanations about how the world worked. So it would be hard for me to say how much of my interest in Jung emerged from that, but it was certainly part of it. I started looking for answers in various directions, and I was reading kind of anything I could get my hands on in terms of philosophy that I found penetrable. My ability to get into that was hard. I devoted my summer when I was 16 to reading The Phenomenology of Being, Hegel. And, that was a slug. I remember I had a really great dialectic centerfold. And I was going through it. Some of that I could pick up and a lot of it I couldn't. But the point was that I started sort of attempting to approach different kinds of texts that seemed like they might have something useful to say. Colin Wilson, who's an odd sort of British actor, or not actor, writer, who was sort of one of the movement of angry young men in the 50s. I read a lot of his work when I was young, and it's exceptionally wide-ranging. So he's interested in literature and poetry and ballet and religious experience, but also criminality and the occult and sort of the forbidden zones, the things that we are not supposed to talk about for the most part because they're considered inexplicable. So reading a lot of that stuff also pointed me in Jung's direction. And it's interesting you say that he was everywhere, because my perception is actually that that's true, but as a countercultural current. Right? He gets picked up by the Beatles counterculturally. Yes, he appears on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's, which is this huge album, but like, so does Aleister Crowley, right? Like, there are figures in there where they are very much thumbing their nose. And it's interesting to look at which Beatles picked which figures and why, right? So it's there, but it's countercultural. It's not foregrounded. Yes, the Police have, right, the album Synchronicity, and there are the Synchronicity tracks. Again, they're sort of, they're like flagging an interest, but not a deep dive in this sense. However, the ideas as a whole, when I encountered them, when I started reading them, some of them seemed hard to wrap my head around, and my ability to read Latin and Greek was not great, so I was bogging in places. But some of it struck me as being, in some ways, self-evident in a way. So as an example, okay, there is a notion in Jungian thinking of the archetype, okay? And the archetype is this kind of structuring element of experience. When I was very young, I read a Dungeons and Dragons book, okay, called Deities and Demigods. Okay, it's just a source book of different pantheons, right? Different historical religious traditions, and attempt to codify that stuff so that, I don't know, players can kill it or something. Okay. But the point is, when you flip through a book like this, or when you are interested in comic books, which I also liked, or whatever, you begin to, of course, pick up repetitions on the theme. Think of this as like a pop culture version of Joseph Campbell's Isolation of the Hero. Like, it was relatively easy to see that different cultures had minor differences in the way that they were carving reality up and assigning it to different gods, but there didn't seem to be any absences of that. Like, the bases were all covered. Like, everybody had a sky god, for instance. Yes, the Norse sky god was the warrior, right, rather than the king or something, but like, in many ways, it was surprisingly consistent. They were like pitch-shifted versions or transposed versions. So when I encountered this, it in some ways seemed very obvious. It's like, well, yes, of course, this is true. And obviously, to me, those structures were a little bit like languages. Languages differ in terms of their ability to express things and how well they express things. Certain languages are good at certain things, other languages aren't. English's response to this has been not even to borrow words so much as like follow other languages into an alley and roll them for, loose syntax and loose whatever. It absorbs everything. But, we don't have a good English word for a concept like déjà vu, for instance. When we say déjà vu, we just steal it from French. Right. Other words like algebra, obviously, like, we pick certain terms because they exist in somebody else's language that's expressing them quite well. But in a different sense, every language sort of addresses the field of experience, right? They map it differently. They use different grammars. They instantiate it into slightly different words, but it's there. And so in that sense, it seemed to me that religions were like languages in this way. They were all attempting to map a thing. They did so in slightly different ways, but they were in many ways functionally very similar. And so hearing Jung talk about the archetype and the expression of the archetype in the sort of archetypal image and in the complex. So the archetype is the thing in itself. You can't really get at that. The archetypal image is the cultural specific layer that you encounter, right? And then your complex is the specificity in some sense of what you yourself have in orbit around that. Your personal association, peccadillo, idiosyncrasy. So much of the Jung that I read at the time, it made a big influence on me. And it, in some ways, fed into a general interest that I had in the exploration of consciousness. It seemed like another method or another mode of thinking that could be used in the exploration of consciousness. And, at the same time, I was becoming interested in the psychedelic work of the 60s. So I was reading a lot of Timothy Leary, things like this, but also old Scientific American articles on experimentation with LSD or psilocybin or sensory deprivation or things of this kind. I was becoming interested in religious and meditative traditions, and it became quite clear to me that those things also were inducing what we might call an altered state. So if I encountered things I went to a Catholic grade school, despite the fact I was not Catholic, and encountered, various forms of prayer and ritual, that to me seemed like it was of a piece. And I was at the same time becoming more and more interested in the Western magical tradition. And all of those things sort of seemed like they were playing in similar territory about encountering your inner world for fun and profit, as it were. That's maybe a glib way to put that. But, encountering your inner world to see what effect that has. Yeah. And even then, I had quite a few encounters that were hard to account for in a purely materialist, rational, reductionist, naturalist kind of way. Experiences that were sufficiently inexplicable that I had a hard time squaring them off against the relatively sort of, the banal, the prosaic world that was the world that we were supposed to be operating in. So that mythic dimension to experience was very accessible to me in a certain sense. And I became aware quite early that it was possible to shift oneself around in that space and thereby, in a sense, shift identity and experience. And Jung plugged straight into that.
I want to explore all of these experiences, but before we formally start our masterclass, I have to get a comment from you. You seem to sit at this interesting crossroads of so many different interests that you just brought up.
Yeah.
Cognitive science, consciousness, dreams, Buddhist psychology, psychotherapy, role-playing games, lucid dreaming, psychedelics. And all of these might sound like very distinct fields or disciplines, but it seems like almost like Hesse's glass bead game, you're attempting to find this thread that connects all of them. Is it possible to do it?
I don't know is the answer.
Okay.
My suspicion is no. Okay, my suspicion is no, and I'll say why. So Hesse and the glass bead game, Magister Ludi, was also an influence on me. And this idea of being able to transpose ideas between modes was intuitively appealing. And clearly there is something to that. The problem this would run into, at least in my thinking, is the problem of consistency and completeness. So this is, I'm borrowing this idea in a sense from
Gödel.
From Gödel, from Kurt Gödel, and there is a sense in which it is not mathematically apt. The Gödel incompleteness stuff has to do with strict formal systems, right? And so it's possible to play fast and loose. But the basic intuition was that if a system at some level cannot be both entirely consistent and entirely complete, then we have a sort of decision of emphasis to make. And the common decision of emphasis is towards consistency. It's to make certain that everything rationally coheres together so that all the different domains and pieces, the things that are like nominally carved up by the Dewey Decimal System, actually connect together and we get a somewhat complete kind of theory, right? And it's not that I think that is without value, but I see so many people doing that I sort of decided early on that my emphasis, like Jung's, would be in the direction of completeness, which is to say that I would want to include all the phenomena, whether or not I could square those phenomena off with a consistent overall account. That I would reconcile myself to the ambiguity involved in not knowing necessarily how something fits. So that, I think, determines a lot about my fields of inquiry generally. Like, I'm very interested in the mysterious edges of things and what we don't know. I'm also inclined generally to take a kind of like hard Socratic epistemological humility and remind myself and others frequently how little we actually know. Because we have a tendency to think, that we know more. And if you think about something like Dunning-Kruger effect is a cognitive bias that was discovered, 10 years ago, maybe. The idea is, you're having a meal with your family and your uncle starts going off about some damn thing that he knows nothing about, and starts holding forth as though, well, it's all very simple. The Dunning-Kruger effect shows that that is actually a universal, that people tend to speak more confidently and consider something to be simpler the less they know about it. And that the more you know, the more it is the case that you are inclined to say, well, that's complicated, right? And so, in a sense, like prior to Dunning-Kruger being sort of discovered and named, this was something that I have tried to remain exceptionally wary about. Like, obviously, one says things. I make assertions and statements. You can't operate without that. But I have always tried to hold those things very lightly, very provisionally. So in that sense, like, I work to, in a sense, destabilize my own positions, to take radically different and incommensurate positions in turn. So I will spend time, for instance, drilling in on the arguments for hard materialism and attempting to internalize them, to onboard them, to see in those terms. But then a different day, I might attempt to get a drill in and onboard panpsychism, for instance, okay, or some alternate model. And that's just, that's philosophy of mind. But the point is, in a general sense, I'm trying to onboard things that seem incommensurate because, generally speaking, it turns out that all of the accounts are incomplete, and that our theories about the world are, of course, in a constant state of overturn. That is the history of science, right? So I don't assume that our current theories are correct. I try to be honest about what our current theories actually say. I try to be honest about the distinction between the processes of science, which are about predictive processes, right? And the processes of metaphysics, which are about not what the thing does, but what the thing is, in some sense. Those are two different questions, and they tend to be conflated radically. So, yeah, I don't know. I'm interested in edge things. I'm interested in things where I don't think we do have a very good explanation yet. But also, I'm perhaps increasingly aware as time goes on that there is, and maybe this is just me, but that there's an underlying continuity between a lot of these things, that there are a lot of things that fall into this category that seem to actually bear an important relationship to each other. So mystical experience and psychedelics would be an interesting case of this. I've been interested in psychedelics, qua psychedelics, for a long time, and in general, sort of anything that can alter the state of consciousness. But the idea that you might be able to draw from that specific literature to inform something more general about human cognition, right, is relatively speaking new. They took a stab at it in the 60s. It's not like it's a completely unknown idea. But with the advent of, various forms of functional brain imaging, right, more complicated models of how cognition occurs, et cetera, a lot of that stuff is making interesting points of contact. So what in some sense seems like a disparate set of interests on my part, in many ways I found them, at the very least, cross-pollinating in my own mind considerably over time. So
let's explore this cross-pollination and formally start our Cognitive Science, Consciousness, Neo-Jungian Psychology 101 masterclass. Assume that I'm this new student in class today. I have no background in these subjects. You're the expert. And if you indulge me in all these silly questions that I'm going to ask you, hopefully we'll end up creating a beginner's guide or a crash course for dummies like me. Let's begin?
Sure.
Let's do it. You've already given us a very, a fantastic introduction into the Jungian model of the psyche. And I want to now start diving deeper into certain aspects of it. The biggest move that you've highlighted was this move away from the ego at the center to the self as both the totality and the center. And you've likened it to this move away from the geocentric model to the heliocentric model. This is the similar form of blasphemy. And it also caused some amount of friction between Freud and Jung. So let's zone into this. Why was Freud unhappy about it? Why was this move important, to move the ego away from the self? And then how did that change the relationship between Jung and Freud?
There's a lot of things going on here where we are political apes, and there are certainly political reasons involved. It's important to remember that Jung was dubbed basically the crown prince. He was, sort of set up to be Freud's inheritor, and Freud was the older fellow, and there was undoubtedly some transference, countertransference stuff between them, right? Claiming that somebody is the crown prince is what? Symbolically adopting them as a son. Jung had a very broken relationship with his own father, who he sort of didn't really respect. And so in Freud, he found kinship. And famously, the first time they met, they stayed up and talked for 13 hours, right? It was a love at first sight kind of thing. That went on, but as their relationship continued, there were various points of friction. So one was that Jung was considerably wealthier than Freud. Jung had married one of the richest women in Switzerland. And so Jung was independently wealthy above and beyond everything else. That's part of the reason he had time to go and build a castle by Lake Bollingen, right? And I say to people, it's like, I know everybody wants to, I also want to build a castle. But, step one, marry one of the richest women in Switzerland. So the difference in their sort of money was the thing. But really, when Jung started pushing on things, there was a few core points of friction. So one was that he wanted to move away from this ego-centered model. He just increasingly believed that it wasn't just this strict hydraulic thing between the superego and the id, but that there were other centers. The breaking point for that was him publishing his essay about the archetype of the hero, because that really broke substantially away from the Freudian method. That was not part of Freud's account of things, this idea that you might have a heroic inner center that wants to call you to the heroic and that expresses itself mythologically, right? Very much what Joseph Campbell picks up on later. That was sort of the breaking point. But leading up to that, you also had conflicts between them about subjects that we would think of broadly as being parapsychological or occult. Jung had a long-standing interest in things like mediumship, right? The ability to sort of channel spirits or Ouija boards, this kind of thing. This was also, a period where some of the early work in parapsychology was happening. So people were starting to test a lot of these hypotheses. And at the time, the data struck them as very convincing. So Jung saw this as being quite critical. He thought that in many ways, these phenomena represented an important form of evidence of and possibly communication with these unknown psychic forces, right? Freud, on the other hand, quite famously said that the role of psychoanalysis in this was to build a bulwark against the black tide of occultist mud.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So heavy, right? Charged. And, if you happen, there are apocryphal, maybe, stories about arguments that they had on this front. Most famously, the one where the two of them are arguing, and at some point in the argument, Jung says, "Not only am I right, but in a second, the bookshelf is going to make a really loud noise." And Freud went, "Pfft," and then the bookshelf went bang. And, Freud was like, whatever. And Jung says something like, "And now to underline my point, it's going to happen again. Bang." Now, what do we do with that information, right? Now, it's possible that it's apocryphal. We don't know. The story in the telling is maybe not exactly what happened. Let's take that as given. But this is sometimes with the people who want to sort of canonize Jung are often looking to these sorts of phenomena where, in a sense, he shows Freud up. That is the way that story is told. From the Freudian's perspective, Jung was like a little bit unhinged, interested in too much weird stuff, okay? But also, as has been sort of famously disclosed, he got sexually involved with some of his patients, which wasn't absolutely verboten at the time, although we would tend to sort of look at it askance, but this did not sit very well with Freud either. So Freud was not without his reasons, but when they finally have this break over the publication of the hero, the archetype of the hero, he basically excommunicates Jung and more or less gives the entire Freudian, set, the various people who are the inheritors and practitioners of those ideas, the cold shoulder. Jung, for his part, has what we would normally think of as being a mental breakdown. And what I mean by that is that it enters him into this period of profound instability, including what we might think of as borderline sort of psychotic experiences, hallucinations, et cetera, et cetera. The difference in this is that he attempts through the whole thing to work with this material as it's coming up. So he's having these peculiar experiences, but instead of just, I don't know, drinking them away, medicating them away, or talking them away, he decides to engage them in dialogue and exploration. And that stretch of time, what he later calls his confrontation with the unconscious, more or less ends up informing his approach to the work for the rest of his life. The insights that he has in that period end up becoming the now published Red Book, right? Quite famously. So it sort of informs things. And again, he has an underground quality, right? He's not part of the orthodox Freudian set, but nevertheless, he is attracting attention in various directions, even though there are people that will have nothing to do with him. So, yeah, the core differences, if you were looking at the differences of the models, okay, are if you think of Freud's model as hydraulic, very mechanical, Jung's model, in contrast, is dynamic, very dynamic, multi-centered, and there is much more sort of freedom of movement and expression and development. So that's part of it. Unlike the hydraulic model, this model operates in a very real and important sense from the premise that, like the body and like the brain, the mind is alive. And the components of it are also alive. And that changes certain things. So whenever I'm starting anybody in on psychodynamics in general, I try to first get them to just appreciate a point in their life when they have said to themselves, in whatever circumstance, what was I thinking? What was I thinking? Why did I do that? Why did I behave that way? Right? Oh God, what was I thinking? That might be, the difference between setting your alarm when you go to bed at 2 a.m. to wake yourself up at 6 and 6 a.m. self not being too thrilled. Oh God, what was I thinking? It can be having an experience where you're like, what was that about? Like, I just behaved in this way and had this set of thoughts, and it seems inconsistent with how I conceive of myself or my normal behavior. That could be an outsized reaction, right? Like a strong emotional reaction. It may be disproportionate to the circumstance, or it could also be not having a reaction, right? It's some kind of reaction that you have that doesn't square off, in a sense, with your self-conception and experience. What was I thinking? For some people, that stuff can intrude and they're very aware of it. So, a stray thought pops into their head. This happens to me a lot. Things pop into my head, often that make me laugh. And the fact that I'm laughing is an indication that I didn't come up with it in the normal rational sense. It arrives. It's still a mental event. It's clearly at some level part of my mind, but it is not originating inside my consciousness. Dreams are another good example of this. When you are having a dream, you are operating from the position of the ego, albeit it seems a shrunken one, right? You have less capacity. But the people that you talk to and the environments that you navigate in a dream, well, what's generating those? Where are they coming from? Because they're very coherent, right? They are not incoherent noise. Rather, they're highly structured. And so the idea is that, in a sense, you are not alone in here, right? You're not a singular unitive being. Now, once you sort of onboard this idea that there are other parts of you and they're alive, it changes the way that you look for those or try to address them. So the analogy that I use sometimes is like when something drops into the Freudian unconscious, you have an event and it drops, you forget it. It's repressed. It drops into the Freudian unconscious. This is like when you have lost your phone and you're attempting to locate it, right? And so what do? You start looking around. You pull at the couch cushions. You look, did it fall on the couch? Did it fall here? Did it fall there? If you're lucky, you eventually get somebody nearby and you say, call my phone. And you listen, you wait, you listen. And you're like, dee, 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 dee. Okay, there it is, right? It's in the couch cushion. Here it was. Okay, fine. It's not going anywhere. You can make it react from a distance, but it's not going anywhere. But trying to encounter the same kind of idea, but in the Jungian notion, you have to encounter the fact that this thing is alive and agentic. It has things that it wants and it has things that it does not want, and it can affect circumstances in order to get those things.
Like a mouse in the cushions.
Mouse in the cushions, exactly. So this is, if you've ever had the pleasure of having mice, and I have once, if you ever have the pleasure of having mice, what happens? You're sitting on the couch or something and it's quiet and you hear, a little something, right? Okay, at that point, what are your moves? Well, you can't just do what you did with the phone, right? I mean, there's no method of making the mouse shriek until you find it. You can't do that. And you can't just reach into the couch cushions. You can't even pull the couch back because the mouse is actively evading you. The mouse is taking steps to evade you. And indeed, the mouse is making choices which allow it to evade your attention deliberately. Complexes are more like this, right? They're slippery in the sense that they are trying to evade you in some sense, right? So you can't just sort of like pull it out and it's static and here you go. Rather, you're dealing with something that has its own aims, its own perspective, and its own access to the space of your overall consciousness and awareness. So how do these things then get what they want? Well, the basic tool set is very simple. They make you feel something in association with something else, a simple pairing. They make things stand out. So they make things more salient to you, or they make things less salient to you. Occasionally, a complex breaks through more strongly than that, but that alone is typically enough to both evade your attention and guide you by the nose to get you to do what the complex wants you to do in various ways. And then if that stuff doesn't square off against your own self-conception, usually it just slips away. You just discard it. That doesn't count. That's not me, right? That's a one-off, or here's an excuse or whatever. You don't ever say, oh, that is also part of me, as you would in shadow work. So this notion that it's dynamic and alive accounts for the ways that you have to deal with it. You have to deal with these things in taking into account the fact that they are in some way agentic, right? That they have seemingly perspectives and desires, that they are mental creatures. So that's part of it. That also expands and means that therefore you can dialogue with them. So it's not just an interpretive matter of exhuming something and making sense of it, the way that the Freudian model is like, here's a dream. What's the inner myth? Okay, here it is. And that's the answer. Rather, you are in a set of tensions and relationships with all these different parts with different kinds of agendas. Yes, orbiting around the general center of your life, but much of what those pieces are doing, what they're concerned with, and how they affect things are just simply not the same as the egos. The ego has often fixed ideas that do not include these things. And in some cases, the things are simply manipulating you to get what they want. And in others, they're, remaining quite invisible, right? They're evading you to meet their need and keep you from meddling around. So the difference between them is actually a lot broader in some ways than it appears. In many ways, the models are quite similar for Freud and Jung. But the approach that one uses in the Jungian model is a lot more dialogic, right? And sort of multi-voice. It's a lot more multipolar. It's not a simplifying method. You don't simplify things, you complexify them. And the idea is not, as in the Freudian system, Freud famously said that the role of psychoanalysis was to change neurotic unhappiness into regular unhappiness. Okay. So like if you can get at the neurosis and surface it in a consciousness, and then you know the issue, you stop behaving in the neurotic way, and now you could just deal with the general misery of your existence. And Jung moves this towards the concept of individuation, which is a complicated, thorny concept. But the idea is this ongoing dynamical growth of you and all of the parts of the psyche and figuring out your appropriate relationships with each other, your dialogue with the wider psyche, including the collective, is this process of becoming individual, which is to say, curiously enough, not that you are literally indivisible, which is how people take it, right? That they become one thing and one thing only. It's not that at all. But rather that you enter into an appropriate set of relationships with all the different dynamics and components that make you up, so that you stop getting in each other's way. And sometimes that means opening dialogue with a piece of self so that it stops trying to screw up something that the ego is trying to do. But often, it's about the ego releasing a death grip on events in order to listen to other portions of the psyche, other parts of this overall system that have important contributions to make. So in that sense, the sort of states and models are actually quite different, even though there's a lot of superficial sort of similarity between them and they share some common premises.
You were once asked why Jung, and in the moment, while you were slightly surprised by the question, once you thought about it, you said it was because he took seriously the realities of the soul. He was not afraid of exploring the things at the edges of consciousness, which you've also highlighted. The ego is not at the center. There's this popular story about this policeman who comes across a blind man searching for his keys under the streetlights. And he says, "Oh, is this where you lost your keys?" He says, "No, I lost them over there, but this is where the light is.
This is where the light is good."
Yeah, and that's why the ego feels like it's at the center. Okay, so far we've been talking about the Jungian model, and you're not exactly an orthodox Jungian. You're a disciple of Neo-Jungian theory. So what's the difference between the two?
Partly because I think of the way that Jung was sort of exiled from the serious academic realm, right? In some way, he became an outside figure, a bit persona non grata. So because of that, in some ways, the Jungian set has, there's a tendency to canonize him, right? To treat him as being almost prophetic, right? So that the collected works are they are the text reference and so on and so forth. And some of that is being embattled, I think, in that set. I don't fall into that set. I think Jung is very human, is flawed like other humans, and like every other theory I've encountered, at least half of it is wrong. Like, I take that to be a given. However, he is clearly a very gifted clinician, and his sense of sort of inner phenomenology is excellent, and his ability to connect those things. He's a sloppy philosopher at best, but he manages to connect this to felt inner experience and the attempted transformation, right? He's practical at the end of the day, even though it's very abstract. The difference when you get into Neo-Jungians, I mean, this is the people who weren't following his method precisely, or they had differences of interpretation. James Hillman is a good example of this. He places much more emphasis on image over other aspects, and he doesn't like the self. He wants a fully polytheistic, multipolar, right? No unifying monotheistic point in the mind as the self, right? So Hillman is a breakaway. He's a Neo-Jungian. There have been a number of generations of other theorists talking about Jung. I would say that my positioning within this is that I don't take Jung's interpretations canonically, although I still, reference back to them. I think that some of the things in his model that tracked really well for the time period are conceptually clunky in our time period. So one of these famously is this notion around contrasexual soul image. He has, antiquated, right? He has like late Victorian, early 20th century views around sex and gender. And you see those expressed in his work. That, I think, is no longer, it just no longer maps especially well to what we actually experience in people. Socially and in terms of their sense of things, the theory around it. So there are a number of Jungians who have sort of been engaging this. There's lots of queer Jungian analysts in the space that have sort of played around with it. So I take all of that with, a grain of salt. I use his basic concepts. I hold them lightly. I recognize that they are neither finished nor absolute, nor they're metaphorical, many of them. It's an attempt to get a handle on a phenomenon. On my side, I'm also bringing in a bunch of material from other traditions. So my educational background is in cognitive science, and I studied with John Vervaeke. That material is concerned with similar sorts of questions, in a sense. And to me, it seemed obvious early on that there were a lot of conjunctions, a lot of important conjunctions between the way that cognitive science was beginning to think about these things and the way that Jung had described them, provided that you treat those descriptions not as absolutes, because progression in the science. So that's sort of the one key point of the Neo-Jungian integration for me, is that I see cognitive science and Jungian psychology as having a lot in dialogue and a lot of overlap. So that's part of it. The other part of it is it's an expanded sense in some ways of the exploratory aspects maybe of Jung in consciousness, that I think his model of consciousness in some ways is impoverished. Not bankrupt, but impoverished. And in that sense, I'm very interested in the extremely wide body of the altered states literature, such as it is, because I think all of these things speak to, in a sense, places the mind can go or modes that it can enter, which can affect, your sense of consciousness, your sense of construal, right? What things mean to you, your sense of connectedness, your altered states of affect, altered states of identity. All of these transformations of our experience in different ways, be it meditation, psychedelics, deep brain stimulation, sensory deprivation, right? All of these different things and dream represent distinct spaces where you get a different lens on your mind. You have a different angle. So one of the reasons that I think it's that aspect, that the altered states piece is as important as it is that Jung sort of operates in the, there are 3 or 4 states kind of thing. Dreams are important, right? As a state of consciousness. Waking life is important. Active imagination, which is a sort of probably like a mid-level visualization alpha state, I would say, for most people, like alpha frequency, that's important. And then, he has a sort of a loose accounting of when there are psychic invasions, in a sense, right? Like his own confrontation with the unconscious. So he's working in some ways with an altered statesy kind of framework already, but I think that the account and what he had access to and research around it is impoverished. He didn't have much to say about lucidity. He didn't have nearly the same kind of acuity as we now have on all of the different dream states that one can enter. And even though altered states as a whole, as a field, in my opinion, is very much, it's not yet a science. What I mean by that is biology becomes a science with Darwin, right? When you start to have stable homogeneous classes, when you begin to have a sense of the relationship between things.
Before that, the people just putting finches in curio cabinets.
Finches in curio cabinets.
That's right.
Yeah, it's collecting weird things from the Galapagos, right? And you sort of put them all in the cabinet and you say, look, isn't that odd?
It's like an exotic hobby of sorts.
Yeah. So obviously, there are indigenous traditions that have altered states of all kinds embedded in them in their ritual practice and so on. It's, you don't have to go far into anthropology to find that. But our current account of altered states is a little bit like the finches. It's maybe a lot like the finches. We have all of these things, but we don't yet have a very clear sense of what the sort of dimensions of change are, or how how these states relate to each other. How do they form? What is the integrated account of the space that those states are moving in? I'm putting this in multiple layers of scare quotes, right? And Jung, I think, has a slightly impoverished view of this stuff. Famously, for instance, he's opposed to psychedelics. And his opposition seems to be something like, you shouldn't muck around and blow the lid off your unconscious when you're not ready. And that's what psychedelics do. And to me, that is a really culturally myopic view. These are things that have thousands of years of history and cultural embeddedness. People have been using altered states to do stuff for a long time. So what position are we to say, oh, you shouldn't investigate your consciousness in this way? It's well, what about all the cultures that have already done so, ostensibly? So, and continue to do so. Plus, yeah, I think it's a very deep human need. We love altered states. We seek them out all the time.
Would you go as far as saying they're essential? Because you're right, currently the approach towards, let's say, psychedelics or lucid dreams is oh, it's such an interesting experience or something cool that you can talk about with your friends. But would you go as far as saying if you truly want to explore the boundaries of your cognition, of awareness, you have to put your state in these altered states so that it differentiates and integrates back into higher levels of complexity?
I think that it's probably not technically indispensable, which is to say that I suspect that the range of states that a normal human being passes through with no exogenous interference is probably sufficient, actually, to run a certain amount of mapping. But I do think that for people with the temperament to deal with it, right? Because not everybody has the temperament. Not everybody, if people are highly, highly anxious, or if they're already, experiencing schizotypal symptomology or something, you don't necessarily want to add more variation or something to that system. It can be dangerous. So it's not for everybody. But for people that, have the temperament and are willing to do that, yeah, I think it is an invaluable aid. I don't know that it's strictly necessary, but I think that it can contribute, like other techniques, to a shortening of the way. It's possible to get certain forms of insight in that way that are extremely difficult to come by through sort of raw mental effort or something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very similar to Ilya Prigogini's work on dissipative systems, where you have to add small amount of chaos or some entropy, and then the system is going to break initially, but then it's going to form back up in a quicker fashion, shortening of the way you're calling it.
A shortening of the way. So, I mean, that's partly it too, is that at least in my own, you referenced this when you were like, I had a cataclysmic psychedelic mystical experience, and I did. Temperamentally speaking, obviously, like I was well positioned to be able to absorb having my whole universe blown apart. Like it was it wasn't at odds with the sort of things I was already interested in.
You could handle it.
Yeah, it was helpful, right? But yeah, so, sometimes it is the case that adding a little bit of chaos is what causes the unstable thing to form into its new, more complex formation, right? Like in Prigogine. And sometimes it's the case that you really need a short, sharp shock to dissolve the current stability. A little bit like in Insight when you have frame breaking and frame making. Sometimes a psychedelic or other kinds of exogenous or even endogenous altered state serves to come in and shatter the simple and problematic formulation that your mind already has. Like it busts it up. Like the Lego. If everything is already combined, then you may find it very difficult to solve certain problems. Sometimes you need to break things down more considerably. But of course, that is always deeply threatening and is, as frequently as not, perhaps appropriately, experienced by both the ego and other components in the psyche as death. Right? You're very attached to the way that you are already composed. And so trying to break that up and put it together from scratch, deeply threatening. What's interesting to me in those experiences is that having had a number of them, what really catches me is, of course, that it does spontaneously reorganize. There are small differences, but you don't have to sit and put the pieces together. It brings itself back together and often does so in a way that gets you around the fixations and inflexibilities, the deadlocks and blind ends of the previous personality structure in that sense. So I don't think it's literally necessary, but I think that it can represent a substantial shortening of the way. And if it's applied in the right way and it's integrated correctly, it can give you shortcuts, in a sense, into parts of the psyche that are otherwise extremely difficult to get at and modes of being that are hard to get at. Like the sort of psychedelic dictum, once you get the call, hang up the phone, which is, even Timothy Leary didn't put LSD on his cornflakes every day. The idea is not just to keep taking it. The idea is to take it, you have an experience, and then, again, you're folding that back into your understanding. You're attempting to integrate it and thus challenge conceptions you have, complexify your ideas. And also, I think, if you are being really intellectually honest about it, there are experiences that become quite difficult to explain under what we would think of as normal rational conditions. Some of those things, are easy enough to account for. So for instance, when people talk about taking DMT, right, which is sort of the active component in ayahuasca, one of the most common things that people will say, and I was told this many times before my own experience with this particular substance, people will say it was more real than this world, right? Realer than this. And like, oh, you don't understand. This is the shadow image world, right? This is Plato's cave. And that is the really real world. And I was always quite resistant to that because to me, it violates a sort of idea about what you're bringing back, right? You bring back the treasure. You go down, you go to the underworld, you go on the quest, you bring something back. And the question that I always had was like, yeah, okay, but what did you bring back? Because I don't live there. I live here.
Right.
What did you bring back? And I could never really get a coherent answer. The first time I had DMT, I was surprised, not surprised, but I was a little surprised that it was sort of exactly what it said on the tin. Like the way that people had described the experience was actually, it's like, oh yeah, right? And who knows whether or not there's an anticipation effect involved there, but it really matched very closely what people said, including that experience of experiential hyperdensity, of being more real than this, right? It had that experience attached to it. It also had this tremendous amount of certainty. Now, it happens that, the way that I think about things, my relationship to certainty is deliberately distanced. So one of the first things that I said to the person who was interviewing me about this afterwards, we ran through the Hood mystical scale and did some things because we wanted to see like, well, what is that? Where does the state fit, basically? And he asked me, what the takeaway, and he said, what about the afterlife thing? Because people often come away with a very strong notion of the survival of life after death or consciousness after death. And I said, well, if I didn't have the particular skeptical frame that I have towards interpretation, I would probably be convinced of the reality of my immortal soul. And he said, really? And I said, yeah, it's a very strong experiential thread in this. Like it really hammers at you this sense of certainty. But the sense of certainty is fluctuating, fluid, unreliable. People are certain of things all the time, uncertain of things when they want to be certain, share differing certainty. Certainty means very little. So I don't take certainty, even the powerful emotional sense of certainty, to indicate certainty, if that makes sense. But I don't think that's a move everybody is making. I think for the most part, people take that sense of certainty as certainty. Nevertheless, having those kinds of unusual experiences, to me, provides novel perspectives, in a sense, novel ways of interfacing with the same material in your mind. And therefore, gives you opportunities to do, well, the very thing that I said, the notice invariance. Like, what are the features that stick around when the mind is otherwise completely changed? Well, what does that mean? What remains consistent and what is mutable and contingent? Likewise, it often offers an opportunity to, insofar as the boundary around ego and self-conception dissolves to some extent, it can be easier to sort of, in some sense, apparently make contact with things that appear to be, right, autonomous or semi-autonomous, appear to have their own existence, etc. Again, what metaphysics you assign that is a different question. When a deity appears in your living room, in a sense, you can be like, is this a projection of my mind? Is it a literal, actual spirit? It doesn't matter. You got to talk to it either way. Yeah. Or you can ignore it. You can pretend it's not there. But in general, I think that ignoring those sorts of features is losing an opportunity and also opens one up to the potential dangers. Remaining ignorant of those other forces means that you are just getting pushed around, led by your nose. You're in the dark about why things are so confusing.
What's so unique about this psychedelic experience? Because, of course, there's some power to fiction. Let's say if I'm watching Shakespeare in the Park, right? There's no part of my brain that's fooled that this is actually happening, because just in my visual periphery, I can see the trees, I can see a skyline in the distance.
But there is a part of you that's fooled.
Exactly. So when I'm watching Shakespeare in the Park, or I'm watching a movie, or I'm reading a book, or I'm playing an RPG game, even though there's a surface and there are things in my periphery that are constantly pointing out that maybe this is not real, my mind is tricked into, like, it evokes some emotional reactions. But even though there might be some amount of reflection after I've interacted with it, when it comes to psychedelic experience in particular, it feels like after that experience, I come back questioning reality a lot more in comparison, let's say, watching Shakespeare in the Park. Why does that happen with psychedelics?
I think it's a bigger state shift. If we want to think about consciousness, and this is one model that may turn out to be wrong and it's hardly formalized, but if we want to think about it as a sort of state space, okay, with all of the potential possible states and configurations of your consciousness, right? Taking something like a psychedelic is pushing you way outside, typically, the zone that you're normally operating in. All right. So it's just a radically different experience. There is lots of variation in your day-to-day experience. We experience it being depressed, being in love. These are both strong altered states relative to whatever, right? Any strong emotional state is an altered state in that sense. insofar as it changes your behavior, it changes your self-identity, it changes your sense of construal, what things mean, right? It can alter your whole sense of the universe and how it works. So if you've ever experienced serious depression, serious anxiety, you understand those two are altered states, clearly. Being engaged in a book, this is a somewhat acquired psychotechnology, but we've gotten pretty good at it, right? At essentially dissociating ourselves from our direct sensory experience in order to engage and, in a sense, fuse with something that we are watching. Storytelling is quite fundamental to humans. We pick up those features and we onboard them and we experience them vicariously, right? And this is not so far from Aristotle's theory of fiction as catharsis. What happens? There is a kind of symbolic thing that we identify with occurring on the stage, and when the tragedy occurs, the Aristotelian account is we get a release of tension because it happens there and we are associated with it, and so we get the emotional pull. But the fact that we get the emotional pull at all is kind of remarkable. On the other hand, it's a light altered state. You can break it off anytime you want. It can be hard. You can be lost in a book and somebody can come into a room, and if it's a really good novel or something, right, you can be so fixed in it that you don't hear them at all, right? They have to like rouse you. Hey, it's dinner. What? Television, same thing. Film, same thing. Like, yes, at one level, I understand that none of the characters on Friends were friends.
Right.
And that they didn't live there. And that this isn't at all, like, it's not represented, it's entirely scripted and constructed and whatever. But that doesn't mean that I'm not going to experience an emotional reaction to it. So this right there speaks honestly to the fact that there are different simultaneous minds operating. On one level, my mind takes it for granted that this is real and should be reacted to appropriately. On a higher level, I'm like, it's not though. It's actors and it's whatever. But those two things are not in communication with each other. And if they were, if you spent your whole time watching a television show or a play, Shakespeare in the Park, and going, this isn't real. This is so unrealistic. You'll get kids that do that, right? It's like, no, you're missing the point. You're not doing the thing. You're not plugging into it. You're seeing what's in front of you and not allowing yourself to merge with it in a way that moves you. Same thing with TV. If the whole time you're watching the TV, like I often think my partner has a dog and a cat. And so I often think about what the dog and the cat see. What are they experiencing? And the dog, okay, will occasionally become quite interested in what's on the television, right? Especially if it's other dogs. And the cat seemingly could not care. And it's interesting. I've heard of people's cats paying attention to TV, a bird or something, they'll become quite rapt. But for the most part, they don't care. There's nothing for them to engage with there. Because neither the dog nor the cat has any interior structure, probably, that maps to cop drama.
Right.
There's no such thing as a cop drama for dogs. Not yet. Anyway, but, so we have structures inside of us that resonate when we do this thing, which is an altered state. It's lightly dissociative, but lightly. The kinds of things that happen, not every psychedelic or not every drug is equally strong either. People that have a small amount of cannabis aren't having a world-shattering change in their mental state or consciousness. It's just a tweak. It's a light tweak. It's like, having one drink. Well, what does one drink do? It makes jokes a little funnier. It tends to reduce your inhibition slightly, which is good if you're nervous, and not so good if you lean in too hard on that, right? It reduces the top-down control so that you can be more effusive, more emotional, more engaged. It reduces your control to improve your experience. That's why everybody does it. Taken too far, what happens? Too much loss of control, lots of breakage, and then you will get behaviors coming out of people that are seemingly dissociated from their standard appearance. So the so-called mean drunk. The mean drunk is often somebody who is perfectly friendly under other circumstances, but get them to a certain line of alcohol, reduce the top-down ego enough, and all of a sudden a whole other personality and set of behaviors, which can be quite consistent, comes out. And that person may have almost no recollection of that. That's often true. They're often deeply ashamed about it. Like, oh God, I did the thing again, right? But it's a very Jekyll and Hyde moment for them. So, there's a whole spectrum here is what I'm getting at. Even exogenous altered states occasioned by things like psychedelics could be on the light, it is just a coloring side. But when you start to push these things up into the high ends, you're getting reorganization and disorganization of psychic experience at a level that we do not commonly experience in the day-to-day, with a few exceptions. Dreams are highly disorganized relative to regular consciousness, although extremely organized. They sit in very close proximity to regular consciousness, right? They have a lot of features in common. So I'm often thrown when people use dream as their benchmark for weirdness. Oh my God, it's like a dream. It's like, dreams aren't that strange. Like they're a lot like waking life. They have time and space and occasion and people and lots of things that are part of our common experience. There are altered states that don't have those things. So already the metrics are quite different. The first time I had ketamine, I was having a surgical procedure. So, they were like ketamine and they were like, okay, we've decided that we're not going to use regular general anesthetic. We're just going to use ketamine. And I'm like, oh, okay. And they're like, is that okay with you? And I had to tamp my enthusiasm a little bit because I didn't want to say like, yes, please, because then I thought they're going to think you're drug seeking. But I was like, well, actually, it's interesting. I sort of do work in this area. So I'm sort of keen to have the experience under medical supervision and, whatever.
That's tempering excitement.
Yeah. Oh, that definitely brings excitement. And that's temperamentally, that's partly the thing. I'm a very high openness, high need for cognition, but also, to be honest, to engage these things is a certain kind of risk taking. It's scary. It's always scary, almost. I mean, initially anyway. So anyway, they administered the ketamine. It was a fascinating experience. But as I was coming out of it, the nurses are coming around to give me my cup of orange juice. And I've just come out of this, reality melting experience of golden ice cream temples and whatever. And really kind of incommunicable, a bit ineffable. And so the nurse is going to give me the orange juice. And I say something. I say some statement while I'm still in the hinterlands between states. And she says, oh, did you have a nice dream? And I was so puzzled. And I was like, well, I wouldn't call it a dream exactly. Like, it wasn't a dream. And she was like, oh yeah, okay. What would you call it? And I'm like introspecting and I'm like, an experience? Like, I don't know what to call it, but it didn't share the parameters of dream. It didn't have the flavor of dream. It didn't have the features of dream. It was an altered state, but not a dream. Dreams are a certain kind of thing, mostly, right? So there are states that we encounter that are powerful like that. Fever dreams, obviously spontaneous experiences of all kinds. Lots of things that we tend to label as psychosis are, relatively speaking, extreme experiences. You can find lots of things in the annals of brain surgery, brain injury, right, where people will have these radically reorganized experiences. But for the most part, we're playing within a certain range, wake, sleep, our emotional range with some spikes in that, like a few things of this kind, and probably some oddball experiences. A psychedelic is an opportunity to go way out to the edge of the map often, and then return back into the original state with an entirely different sort of perspective and mode of being. Because once you've been out here, it's like, oh, right, that is also a possible mode. That is a possibility in my organization. And if that reveals certain things, is it the case that those things can be accessed or integrated in regular waking experience?
You created the sense of contrast of psychedelics with dreams. So let's explore dreams next. You've often said that dreams are like animated movies. If in a live action film, if it's a gladiator movie and there's an extra wearing a watch in the back, then it could be a mistake.
Yeah,
it's not intentional. Yeah, it's just an error. But if it's an animated movie, then that watch is intentional. It was designed, and you've said every dream is like that. Every single detail in a dream, it's intentional and it's designed. So let's dive into dreams. What happens when we dream? Are these just byproducts of brain activity, just random visuals that you're getting? Or are they more meaningful projections of the unconscious?
This is far from like a settled question in the field.
It's not?
But I can give you my account.
Okay.
I'll give you my account. What I think, essentially speaking, happens in dream is that we're cut off from external stimulus. So there is something of a sensory deprivation quality, right? Our senses are deliberately offline and our movement is limited. And if you think about the cycle of dream and memory consolidation, okay, we know that REM sleep, which is traditionally associated with dream, what we would think of as phenomenal dreaming, is also associated with procedural memory consolidation skills. So it seems like if you deprive REM from the system, procedural consolidation goes down. So at some level, what is happening in REM is procedural consolidation, skill consolidation. Okay. We can talk about NREM in a bit because it's less well understood. So the idea is that at some level, what is clearly happening is that your brain is practicing. It's a simulator in a sense. But how does that simulation work is the question. Well, let's look at the phenomenology of dreams. Despite the fact that you're cut off from your environment, what happens in a sense, it seems, is that your ego, your regular operating consciousness, shrinks. And when I say shrinks, what I mean is that your regular rational powers are partly or largely suspended. So you will see something in a dream space that is incongruous, but it won't necessarily register to you strongly how incongruous it is. There will be features and elements of dreams where you're like, well, I was in a barn, but it wasn't a barn. It was my aunt's house. And there was sort of this butter sculpture of Zeus. And if you just walked out the door and encountered this, you would be strongly thrown by the weirdness of that. But our ability to detect that incongruity, to do co-relevance realization, in a sense, is clearly reduced. Okay. And that's consistent with a few things like Tononi's integrated information theory, right, which we don't have to get into. But yeah, there are a few people. So, okay. So instead, you are reduced, but something in you is simultaneously generating an environment for you to interact with. And that environment contains figures that interact with you in various ways. So one place that you can plug this in is there was an idea called the threat simulation hypothesis with Revonsuo, who says that what dreams are basically designed to do is model potential threats. It gives you opportunities, right? If you're a tiny mammal, it gives you opportunities to run this cycle where you have a day, but then at night, you practice escaping owls or whatever. You're a mouse, you practice escaping owls and foxes, okay? And so then the vast majority of your dreams are nightmares, basically. One thing that I said early on, and he's since amended this theory, but when the theory was sort of going then, one thing that I said was that is a weirdly coded version of how evolution, in a sense, works. We don't just avoid threats, we also pursue opportunities. Like both things are equally, you can evade threats all day, but if you don't eat or mate, you're not going to do anything. So it's not just about evading threats. It's also about practicing opportunities. You can see this somewhat in dreams too. So there's an emphasis maybe on threat. Kids have about 4 times as many nightmares as adults, for instance, but there's also opportunities. Now the second piece comes through acceptation. So acceptation is the evolutionary principle. It's how natural selection creates new functionality typically. It doesn't just create it out of nothing. It adapts something that's already working to fit the new thing, acceptation. So as an example, the tongue, a human tongue is accepted for speech. What is the tongue? The tongue is designed, it's a muscle. It's designed to push food around so that you're chewing rocks. Chew it, right? That's function one. Second, because it can move around like that, right? Because it's sort of dexterous, it has a lot of nerve access. So it's also been accepted to be a chemical detector. Here is something that is sweet. Here's something that's bitter, therefore probably alkaloid and dangerous, et cetera, et cetera. So it's got chemical sensor and it's got move food around. We accept it for this other thing. We accept it to speech. We move it to shape the air and stuff in our mouths, which I won't call too much attention to. Otherwise, I will start to have marble mouth.
Conscious of it.
Yeah. You don't want to do that. Get in the way of your automaticity. So, at least not in this case. So, okay, so there is acceptation. So what you then think is something like the threat simulation hypothesis is giving you these practice of skill in the world simulations. But what is the primary field in which human threat and human opportunity exists? And the answer is the social domain. most of your threat and most of your opportunity actually exists in the social domain. I've never run from a bear. I live in a country with bears. I've never even seen a bear outside of a zoo, right? It just doesn't come up that much. Yeah, there are sort of conventional threats that one might have to be concerned with. I've been attacked by a dog once, for instance, but that's rare. Most of our threat and most of our opportunity is social. And if you think anthropologically, like what's one of the worst punishments you can get? Exile, where everybody pretends you're dead. You get excluded. Those people die often, right? This whole idea of being the lone wolf who makes it entirely on their own, or the omnicompetent Batman skill set, that's not a thing. Not mostly. Humans exist within a relation of communities. So then the dreams are accepted to give us practice in precisely the areas that it seems like we are operating. They give us social practice. Now, in addition to other things, if you play tennis all day, then you're probably going to have tennis consolidation dreams, and that's pretty well established. But most of what you're going to be doing is engaging a social simulator in a certain sense, okay? Notice this is a very science-heavy kind of take on this, and we'll get past this. So in a sense, what's happening? You have an integrated cognition. That cognition shrinks. When it shrinks, in a sense, it becomes dissociated from other surrounding components. Pieces of you that are normally part of the ego are separated through dissociation. The information flow between them drops. When the information flow drops in that way, dissociation, there is a point past which it becomes externalized. So like when people have when they have alien hand syndrome, where they get their corpus callosum severed, and right, there is a dissociation here. All of a sudden the hand is doing stuff, right? And okay, it's dissociated. If you look at those experiments, it's like, okay, there is still an intention. Famous case, this woman had corpus callosum, she had a severing after epilepsy. And every time she went to smoke, this hand would knock the cigarette out of her hand. Now, that's obviously irritating, frustrating in your hand. It's a little scary maybe. But think about for a second what's required for that. That means that something that is not her, something that is not in her ego wants a cigarette. I'd like a cigarette now. That may be compelled by something else, but the ego wants a cigarette. Some other piece of her is like, quit that. And it has to do a whole set of things. Like it has to work and navigate space, and it has to see stuff, and like it has to do complex processing. In the same way, when your mind, in a sense, when your ego shrinks in dream, the other pieces that are normally integrated bud off, and they take on an apparent autonomy with that separation. So they behave themselves. And then some other structure is sort of clothing this whole thing environmentally. Like in a sense, there's another piece that's playing the role of the environment. It plays the dream, and it gives you this little practice drama. Okay. Where this starts to move in other territory is that it is not the case that every sort of structure in your mind or in your brain in this sense is going to be simple. So for one thing, for the same reason that your sense of weirdness goes down in a dream, the blurredness of the figures in the dream is allowing for a certain kind of categorical training, I suspect. So, you can think about this, it's an analogy only, but if you think about Jeff Hinton's sleep-wake algorithm, there's an idea, so this is a generative model, like transformation thing about, yeah. So the idea is like, what do? You move between attempting to detect in the world and then a state where you attempt to create in order to then improve your own model. Like if I can simulate it inside, I can simulate it outside, back and forth. You can think, Jeff is interesting and was never quite clear about whether or not he was aiming at this, but I think that that's actually relatively apt. It may be simply a metaphor, but I think it's relatively apt. What are the interests and advantages of this? Yes, there are some parts of dream that are going to be mundane. People that you know. We've all had dreams where we've encountered somebody that we know, right? And it's like, wow, you were saying weird things, but it was so you. Like the dream got the characterization bang on somehow, right? Okay, so that's fine. It makes sense that we would be practicing people that we know. Dreams also contain unknowns, right? there is a mysterious stranger and I'm with my friend and we're in the mall. That would be a pretty standard sort of dream setup. Sometimes it is the case that what is being put forward is a collective instantiation. In some sense, it might be multiple figures, but it's like one character, like a zombie horde. A zombie horde, I used to have a lot of zombie dreams back in the day. Somehow that's been exercised from me, possibly by the popularity of zombie films. I don't know.
John Vervaeke would say the rise of zombies because of the meaning crisis.
Yeah, I know that's John's take. I have a more personal take. Okay. I mean, I'm sure it's still meaning crisis related because it's hard to escape that umbrella. But when I untangled my own set of dreams, for me, the zombie was about my own projections towards the collective shadow. So intelligence was really important in my family, okay? And was usually the kind of dismissive line that was used against people at large. People are idiots, this kind of thing, right? Don't be stupid was one of the like harsher things you could say. And at the time when I was having these a lot, I was also grappling with the idea that maybe my father had sold out in some sense, because he was like, whatever, a 9-to-5 work a day, whatever. And like, why did you abandon whatever your broader, weirder aspirations, So the kind of thing we get into with our parents. And so I used to have a lot of dreams, and it took me a long time to recognize that a big part of what I was seeing was my own attitude towards collective humanity. My fear of collective humanity, of people. And like how that was in some ways an inherited idea. What are they? They're stupid, slow, move in big groups,
brainless,
want to consume, brainless, but also you got to be careful. They can catch you. And one is not really a threat. One, you can dance around all day long, right? But that's not what happens. What happens is that there's one, then there's 5, then there's 20, and then you're overwhelmed. So you got to keep moving. And the idea was that like they can turn you into one of them was the key thing. It's like the idea is if you're too normcore, they can get you. Untangling that for myself, yeah, of course, that's related to the meaning crisis, but it's a much more personal thing and turned out to be the key to sort of resolving a set of longstanding nightmares. So yes, so dream. So dream gives this access point where you can sort of interact with parts of self in ways that are normally far more difficult. You could certainly do so. There are therapeutic techniques to do so, different kinds of techniques. Hypnotism is another way that you can use. It's now on good empirical footing. You could use that to access parts of self. Like there are other methods you can use, but dream is an already available forum where you're going through this process on a regular basis. And if you take the right approach, this is going to tell you things both about your sort of inner population. Because when you encounter your friend and they say something crazy but it's so them, yeah, it's not though. It's not them at all. It's you, by definition. Unless you believe that you and your friend are meeting in another dimension or astral plane, and some people believe that, everything you're encountering is necessarily you. So this tells you a lot about what you have internalized. You can see that, again, it allows you to, in some cases, get at your own projections, get at your own complexes, encounter inner dynamics. And if you pursue it, deeply and over time, there is also the sense that there is more structure there than you are able to perceive easily. So dreams, for instance, are seldom, really properly speaking, you should never do analysis of a dream in isolation. A single dream, if a person brings you a single dream, you can say maybe some very broad strokes things, but technically that is not a good place to do interpretive practice. You should have a sequence. And the thing about the sequence is that over time, you start to realize the idiosyncrasies, the inner grammar of this person's dream life, how things are standing out, which themes are repeated, and so on and so forth. And repetition is the very opposite of noise. Signal and noise. Repetition is signal. So once you have enough of it, you begin to see the patterns start to foreground. That's really where the insights start to emerge and where it starts to produce a kind of dialogue with the dream maker, because the dreams respond to your inquiry, if that makes sense. So there is a sort of evolved field, But there is a further acceptation that consciousness can use in order to use what is a practice space for skills to engage in self-knowledge. And in some ways, lucid dreaming is the kind of, in some ways, I think the logical extension of that.
Yeah, there's been some interesting studies on Turing tests in characters in dreams as well. You've had personal experience in one of your lucid dreaming. I think you're walking through Italy and you came across these characters and you asked them, okay, what's behind me? And they described the cathedral in exact detail. So clearly there's some form of spatial awareness and realism in the dream as well.
Yes.
And when you ask them math problems, they could only answer questions which you would know by memory. So 7 by 7 is 49, but any bigger questions they couldn't answer. And when you probed them, they said it hurts us. Whatever that means.
Which was a disturbing experience. It was strange. It's not unusual in a lucid dream, I find, for the edges of the experience to start to break down a little bit. And this is pretty commonly reported. When you're reaching the end, maybe things begin to flatten or derez or something a little bit. That was a case that was very unexpected. Because, I had read that they were bad at arithmetic. So that was not so much. I mean, in some ways, the test I was setting was probing at that, right? What I did not expect was for them to, I don't know, start to melt a little bit and say, it hurts us. And I was like, what does that mean? Who? It hurts who? Aren't you me? Right? And this is sort of a strange thing at the edge of it. It's like, well, you are, but you aren't. Like, that's a flexible boundary. And right now, you're not. Right now, you're operating outside of the core complex that constitutes my ego. You must be, because I'm interacting with you and I'm surprised by you. Yeah. So I think of lucid dreaming as being a kind of extension in that sense, right? And the work you're talking about is Paul Thoele and sort of the inheritors of Paul Thoele, Stumbris, and there's a sort of a whole German school of stuff that came out of that. They have taken a lot of Paul Thoele's early experiments in, what I came to think of as being sort of a Turing test for dream characters and really expanded, clarified, put it in narrower terms, better experimental design. And it seems quite consistent, right? This whole sort of German school of dream stuff seems to relatively consistently show that they're like people. They behave like people in many ways. Not exactly like people, narrow slices of people, but they have person-like attributes. And that seems quite relevant. They're not impersonal forces.
Everything you say is so fascinating. And I'm cognizant that all these topics require 3-4 hour long lectures on their own. So it would be a crime to move from dreams now. And we only spoke about psychedelics. So many follow-up questions there as well. We have to do part 2, part 3 at some point. But I also want to introduce alchemy into the picture. This is something Isaac Newton spent a lot of time studying, Carl Jung in a very different way. And when people talk about alchemy, the image that comes to mind is of converting these base metals into gold. But I have a feeling that's not what you're talking about. So what do you mean when you talk about this form of cooking, alchemy?
Lots of people do have this historical idea of alchemy as, the quest to turn lead into gold, the quest to create the philosopher's stone, or the quest to create an elixir of immortality, right? There's lots of mythic material around it. Yeah. And I think it's important to flag that historically, I think alchemy was a lot of different things, in the same way as religion is a lot of different things. And people's attitude towards religion can be quite different. So with alchemy, undoubtedly, there were some people who were, essentially speaking, chemists, early chemists. So, dye production was sort of an alchemical thing. These were the people that had some basic sense of the chemistry of the period and the production, certain things that you can produce using those methods. So there were, in some sense, sort of material chemical technicians that were alchemists, right? People who were basically amateur chemists or professional chemists at the time. Okay, so there's that. There are the people who are, let's say, entrepreneurially motivated. That is to say, right? And maybe authentic or maybe charlatans, right? There were both. So there were both people who were really like, I'm going to turn lead into gold, which was not a crazy theory in a sense, given their metaphysics at the time, their picture of the universe and how it worked, right? The idea that these things could occur, like it was not nonsense to Newton, who was in some ways maybe the foremost scientist of his time. And the reason was that their account of matter at the time was not at odds with the idea that you could convert forms of matter between each other. So there are people who really legitimately want to create physical transformations in physical matter. Okay. Then there are the people who pretend to do that to get investors. Not so different than today. The AI boom has, right, distinguishing between the things that are like actually good functions and the things that are, charlatans. Okay. But then there is this other tradition. And it's Jung who sort of points this out, that if you read the texts of alchemists closely, it seems as though in addition to the simple chemical manipulations and distillations, the bubbling lab equipment, that there was something going on that was profoundly charged and filled with images. And when you look at alchemical texts, they're full of the green lion and the black dragon and the language is all highly symbolic. And some of that is an absence of the kind of technical language that we use in chemistry. But it seemed to Jung that there was a lot more to it. That in fact, what there was, in a sense, a kind of spiritual tradition, what he called a yoga of the West. That this was a codified, albeit countercultural, attempt to make sense of the contents of experience and of the weird contents of psychic experience and the unconscious by using a procedure in chemistry as an anchor. So in a sense, it's like you're doing these manipulations outside yourself, but the real juice, in a sense, is the transformations inside yourself, that these two things are in correspondence with each other. That in manipulating the world, you are manipulating your inner life. Right? This is as above, so below, to some extent. So the idea was that, in a sense, this could form a kind of projective screen on which your inner contents could be projected onto the manipulation that you engaged in the chemicals, and thereby you could externalize and alter your own states. That's kind of what Jung is thinking. This is not such a weird idea if you think about it, because that's exactly what we proposed for the stage play example. Precisely what we propose is that we put a thing up, and that by associating with it and projecting onto it and suspending our disbelief, yes, we have a rational level where we're like, those are just actors and that knife looks terrible and whatever. But at a different level, we're deeply associated with it, and it has the ability to, in correspondence with what's happening there, move parts of us around in a way that produces insight, emotional reactions, etc. It creates a correspondence to change our inner experience. And if it didn't do that, we wouldn't be interested. That's why the cat doesn't care. There's nothing for the cat there. There's nothing for it to connect to. So that whole model of projecting something outside of ourselves, manipulating it, and thereby producing an effect inside of ourselves is something that we already see in lots of different domains. Jung's basic analysis is that what we see in alchemy is a kind of early psychospiritual attempt to figure this stuff out and to create a method of altering inner space through the use of material substance. Does that make sense?
Does make sense. Yeah.
Right. So in that sense, alchemists were, they write in a deliberately obscurantist fashion. And some of that is, I'm sure, the idiosyncrasy of their experiences, right? The uniqueness. Some of it is a desire to avoid persecution or to not have people, horn in on their work. Some of it, like within the magical tradition, is a desire to guard important insights and wisdoms against those that are not in a good position to use them. The idea is that there are certain kinds of insights, techniques, and so on and so forth that you got to be at a certain place to engage those things without them causing problems for you and other people. I would argue that meditation is often one of those things, right? You have to be careful about doing that kind of inner work. So in some ways it was deliberately obscure. And trying to compare alchemical texts, again, it's a lot like trying to compare different people's dreams. There are themes which emerge. You can pick up sort of structural themes and stuff, but any given alchemist is going to have a somewhat idiosyncratic take on the material, as you would imagine if it is indeed psychological material. But Jung kind of goes through and he finds a general set of principles which, against the world and worldview of the people writing these texts, seemed to be able to deeply inform his own practice of depth psychology. It spoke a lot to psychic transformation, to dreams, to the kind of encounters that we're talking about with mythic figures and things that are more charged than everyday reality. And therefore that it might, within the body of recorded text that we have remaining to us, right, that there might be a deep record, in a sense, of psychological transformation practices that we have basically been brushing off on the basis that it was like chemistry for dummies. And hence the importance of it, right? That it was an unplumbed tradition and in a sense disregarded, but it might actually be, an early pre-modern, under often different metaphysical premises, but essentially an experimental science of mind and introspection and psychic dynamics, that in some sense it was an early attempt. And like I said early on, I think that there's a whole range of people with different alchemies and different approaches to them. And for some people, I think it was just material bits, making chemicals. But it seems like there is a subset of people for whom it is essentially a spiritual discipline. And thus, to use the cognitive science term, a psychotechnology. And that is the level at which Jung approaches it, and it's usually the level at which I approach it. And I think that there's interesting conjunctions, right, between what we see described in alchemy and what seems to be a kind of emerging picture within cognitive science and in some places within philosophy more broadly.
You also brought up the magical tradition, so let's talk about it. What is magic, and what is Jung's idea of synchronicity and the psychoid, and what are the links between the two?
Sure. Okay, what is magic is the toughie. But, well, it is, right?
So far, it's only been easy questions.
Yeah. What is magic is a toughie, because there are a few different distinctions to make there. One is, are we talking about prestidigitation? That is to say, card tricks, sleight of hand,
rabbit out of the hat.
That's some people that's what they are thinking of. And unfortunately, the spaces are blurred. Is what we mean something like the fictionalized Harry Potter version, which is like, I don't know, whatever. You point your wand and say Excelsior, and somebody changes into a lemon or whatever. I don't know. Believe it or not, I've never read those books.
Yeah, they never say Excelsior.
Yeah, anyway. No, but what do they say? I don't know. Anyway, whatever. I'm not going to try that. Yeah. So, okay. But the point is, it's, able to produce what we would normally think of as impossible transformations in your environment through the use of some kind of codified whatever. And there's the fictional idea. And then in the middle, there is historical practices of magic. And what has magic been? Well, again, there's a blurry line between magic and religious ritual, right? Those two things are probably not as distinct as we want them to be. In the same way as, when Christianity is doing its expansive thing, right? It's like, well, either we're going to syncretically take the local traditions and fold them in. So Easter, right? What does Jesus have to do with eggs or rabbits? The answer is nothing, because it's a festival originally dedicated to the nature goddess Oester, and her symbols were rabbits and eggs because she was a spring goddess. It happened to coincide with when they wanted Easter. Same thing. Why do we put up a Christmas tree? It has nothing to do with Christ. There's no Christmas trees in that story. They do not exist. It's an Odin tree. It just got syncretically absorbed, right? So that happens to some traditions. But the traditions that can't be absorbed are typically labeled as pagan. Somebody else's gods become your demons. And there's loads of those in, sort of Judeo-Christian thinking. It's like, oh yeah, that god over there, that's a demon. In the same way, magic is often somebody else's religion. So whatever your rituals are, those are the legit rituals. If you happen to be Catholic or Christian, you believe in the transubstantiation of the host. What is this? It's a ritual where the priest, not physically, but metaphysically, turns a piece of bread into the literal body of the deity. But the deity he doesn't turn it into meat. There's no physical transformation. There's just the underlying essence is transformed, and thereby by consuming it, you enter a state of contagious grace or something with the divine. Okay, but that's religion and that's legit. Something two shades over from that's magic. So you see my point, right? Like, what are we talking about here? On the other hand, there is also a counter-cultural current that often operates in magic. Magic is frequently the go-to tool of the oppressed, which when you think about it is like, these are people who perhaps have very few opportunities or options or levers to pull on in the conventional, explicit, regular power structure. And it seems like very often magic introduces a kind of release valve. You can't get what you want in one way, so you go to the person who can get it supernaturally. Magic also extends pretty naturally from what seems like the sort of baseline religious impulse, so far as we can tell, of the species, which tends to organize in early kind of lower complexity settings and societies and stuff, right? If you look at hunter-gatherers, it tends to organize around a pretty consistent set of themes. There's kind of animism, the world is alive, there is a spirit quality to things. Spirits can be addressed as persons. It behooves you to do so. You want to have good relationships with spirits. How do you interact with them? Ritual, drumming, which is like a state of consciousness, various states of consciousness, art, but also things that would strike us as art, possibly, but don't necessarily strike them as art. Things like drama performance or the creation of something, right? So art and magic have a blurry relationship to each other. I tend to default down to Crowley, not because I think that he's the best or last word on magic, but he's got a clean definition, which is to say that magic with a CK is the art and science of causing change in conformity with will. So by his definition, you do magic all day. All kinds of stuff that you do is magic, right? It's just like if your will is causing a change and those two things are aligned, then it's magic. I tend to see it more as drawing on the body of techniques that have been invented in various cultures at various times to engage with what seem like non-ordinary states, to engage with seemingly autonomous entities, whether you think that they're internal psychodynamic entities, or you think that they exist in the world independently. The point is that there are sets of techniques for engaging these things. And those techniques bear a striking resemblance in lots of ways to the kind of techniques that we use in psychotherapy for parts work. And so I don't think that that's accidental. I'm inclined to think that magic is, for the most part, a repository of techniques, tools, insights, and methods for altering yourself and exploring yourself, and thereby altering your own nature, being, relationships, and thus your ability to engage with the world. And even though I'm open-minded in some sense about the possibility that there may be things happening in that space that exceed our current account of reality, weird things happen, no question. Things that are very difficult to explain in what would be considered rational terms. Like you would hesitate to tell your psychiatrist. Those things do seem to happen. And I think about that a lot and what the positioning is. But even leaving that aside, if all magic does is give you a set of engaged tools whereby you can actively and creatively engage with your inner being and use that to change your life, well, that's it, isn't it? That's everything. So I think of it as being this more active and personal adjunct to what you would think of as received religious practice, more rigorous than spirituality, which tends to be a little floaty aroundy, less authoritatively hierarchical maybe than most religions, and concerned in some sense with having effect. Although ultimately, I think that there's sort of a mystical backwash that happens. Like I think everybody in some sense gets to the top of the mountain. I'm not sure that it's the same mountain and whatever, but you know, the point is that it is a standalone set of techniques, although it does tend to share space with religion. I'm not sure if I've explained that at all.
You have.
Okay.
So where does synchronicity come into the picture, and then what's the link between magic and synchronicity?
So synchronicity is tricky. Synchronicity is simultaneously one of Jung's best known ideas, leaving aside something like introversion, right, which we don't even remember was him, or complexes. It's, you know, synchronicity is probably one of his best known ideas. It's a thing that people intuitively get a grasp of. So a synchronicity is a meaningful coincidence. And when I say meaningful coincidence, obviously this too occurs on a spectrum, right? When I have a student who comes and says, oh my God, I've been seeing the number 7 everywhere. It's like, that sort of seems like it could be a priming and projection bias. It's not like 7 is uncommon in the environment, right? So there is a tendency to overextend. One step up in that might be like, oh, I was just thinking about so-and-so and they called. Okay, the standard kind of like debunker's line here would be to say, yes, but think of all the times that, you thought of them and they didn't call, or they called and you didn't think of them.
Right.
And like this is jumping out, you're sort of over selecting it. Okay, fine. However, there are some experiences that people describe as coincidences that are shocking. Most people, if you talk to them, will have had one or more of these that strike them with a degree of weirdness. Like, what are the odds? What are the odds of it? Obviously, there are states that can amplify that in all kinds of different ways. If people are experiencing schizophrenia, it's functionally almost indistinguishable from stimulant psychosis, like what you would get from amphetamines, except that you don't hear voices on stimulant psychosis. But otherwise, this like over projection of patterns of meaning and significance could be overwhelming. That's when you like, the number 7 is chasing me around, right? It can lead to a kind of paranoia, et cetera, et cetera. But there are, it seems to me, a certain number of instances where if you do the back of the envelope math, even if you're really coming at it to try to like naturalize it as hard as possible, you're left with this uncanny residuum of like, it just doesn't seem very likely. So Jung describes a few of these famously, where the conjunction is between somebody's inner state in some way, an event that happens in the world that does not seem like it could have been causally related in a way that we would normally think. The most famous version of this is he's talking to a client. The client has a really strong rational attachment, and she's using the rational attachment in a way, it seems to him, as sort of a shield to avoid making contact with these other irrational contents, right? She wants her mind, her thinking mind, to be like in charge, and that is not letting her connect with other parts of herself. And so she comes into her session and she's just had this dream that somebody gave her a beautiful brooch that was like an Egyptian scarab, right? Blue and gold and beautiful. And so he's listening to this dream, whatever. And then he hears the tickety tick, tick, tick at the window. Okay. And he's like, well, that's interesting. And so while she's there, he opens up the window and in flies this scarabate beetle, a not unheard of species for the area, but not common. And more or less like the closest possible analog to the thing that she just described. So tickety tick, 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 it decides to fly into the room, which is weird because lit outside and dark in the room. So that's not normal, whatever. But anyway, and so it flies in and he catches it. And again, how apocryphal, how shaped is this story? We don't know. But the idea is he goes to her and he says, here is your scarab. And the kind of break that this causes, the conjunction, the unlikeliness of it, seems to break her of her fixation. So it's this conjunction between the inner and the outer in some way, in a way that doesn't seem as though it could be causally derived. There's no way that you can think of. And so it ends up feeling like, it feels highly significant in the conjunction. It often has the feeling of being a message. People often have that feeling. I describe it more often as being a kind of wink. It's a wink in some sense across the illusion that we maintain that mind and matter are distinct, non-overlapping magisteria. Something which in many ways is obviously false. But nevertheless, it's still part of our, right? The world is out here. My mind is in here. My mind is an encapsulated little thing. The world is out here. So when synchronicities occur, they seem to speak to there being some higher principle that is orchestrating things and orchestrating them possibly meaningfully. And that's where Jung jumps in. So with the Jung-Pauli conjecture, Wolfgang Pauli, who was probably the preeminent quantum theorist of his day, in many ways, his work with Jung, they end up coming up with this idea that it might be that some of the explanatory framework that was being introduced in quantum mechanics could also be fruitfully applied to these, up to this point, not easy to categorize events, right? You might think it was divine grace or something, but there was really nothing in the account of psychology to account for these things other than to say, whatever, you're seeing patterns where there are none, or you're overstating the significance of it because whatever, right? And so Jung's point is, no, this seems much more significant than that. It tends to coincide with these emotionally high states. And what if that is reflective of an actual feature in some way of the world? What if it is a way of noticing that the world is not these two distinct, non-overlapping magisteria, right? But rather it's speaking to the deeper connection of what he called the unus mundus, the one world. And is it possible that that world is in some sense archetypally structured, et cetera, et cetera? So it's a big change in his thinking because it moves him from being in some sense pretty like scientifically centered and naturalist. You could think of something like an archetype or a complex as being like an inner reflex, just the psychological equivalent of a physical thing. By the time you get to synchronicity, you're dealing with the idea that in a very real sense, he's sort of proposing that the universe is mental, right? That's a big philosophical claim. And under that claim, it means that in some sense, it might not just be that you have a copy of these various features of Jungian psychology, right? The self, for instance, but that maybe in some very real sense, you're actually interfacing with the unconscious in the world and other people in a way that is not causally explainable, but is acausally explainable. Does that track?
Yeah, it does track.
So the thing that I think about and the argument that I've made in this respect, years and years ago, I got drafted to serve a role at this conference that nobody else wanted. So they wanted to have a set of debates around things, and somebody wanted to debate against dualism. And they couldn't find anybody to debate for dualism, right? Because it's not exactly what you would call, it's not a well-supported, defended position at this point. And I was like, okay, sure, I'll do it. I wasn't actually a student, so I was sort of pulled in from outside. But I was like, yeah, okay, I'll do it. And there was a number of arguments that I made, but one of the arguments that I made was simple, which is one of the arguments that you get against dualism is the idea that you can't have causal interactions between two different substances. So if they are completely non-overlapping and whatever, how can they interact? And the answer is, well, there's no causal interaction. There can't be. And the point that I made there was, okay, but that argument only holds up if causal interaction is the only game in town, if that is the only mode of interaction that we allow. If there are things that are not causal interaction, but that we do count as interactions in reality, then that concept has to be on the table. It has to be available to us. I said, and acausality is now better established than almost every physical theory otherwise that we have. Acausality is a consistent, common feature, in fact, in quantum mechanics. Now, that isn't to say, okay, that I'm not trying to commit the quantum fallacy, because a lot of people will say, mysterious thing A, the mind, mysterious thing B, quantum mechanics, isn't it weird? Ergo, the mind is quantum mechanics. And it's like, no, that doesn't fly. But if you have a discipline like quantum mechanics, where you're demonstrating that acausality is a valid structure of explanation, that it's not a nonsense idea, then all of a sudden that's on the table for other things. And in my opinion, that very neatly fits into the acausal connecting principle idea that's in synchronicity. And it neatly fits into what I consider to be the more interesting and provocative results that have come out over the decades in parapsychology, which I think actually has a lot more, I think it's a lot more credible. I think there's been a cultural campaign against it to underground it, but I think that there's more in parapsychology than most people are willing to admit. And it is hard to account for those things, right? People throw their hands up and say, but how could this causally, or it would violate thermodynamics? And it's like, the universe violates causality and thermodynamics all the time. So that can't be our answer. It can't be, not causal, therefore impossible. No, we haven't thought that in 100 years. We've just been slow to kind of catch up. So when I think about it, I think that's a reasonable, not necessarily to say that it is the case, but like it is a reasonable thing to say that it could be the case, that there may be connecting acausal principles within reality that are not sort of the simple picture that we normally think of. And Jung and Pauli thought that synchronicity was, in some ways, the hot point, the thing that demonstrated, this particular interaction. It's like the weirdness where you see how they bleed together, where suddenly you're like, wait, If that's happening, then my conception of things is wrong, right? In some way. That's why I think of it as a wink. When it occurs to me, very often, it serves to jar me out of a very separated, powerless sense. And then all of a sudden I'll have this experience, and it is as though circumstances seemingly have conspired within my experience to go, it's not what you think. Like, stop reifying in this way, right? I'm reminded here, do you know the deceased, the late comedian Bill Hicks?
Heard of the name.
Bill Hicks? Okay. So Bill Hicks has this bit he used to end his show with before he passed. Interesting guy, very belligerent, quite bright. And he would say, what's this show about? What's this show about? Let's see if I can sum it up. He's like, reality is a ride. Okay? Reality is a ride. It's fast, it's brightly colored, it's very loud, and it's exciting, and it's fun to play for a while. And then at some point, somebody comes along and they say, hey, this is just a ride, right? And we kill those people.
Right.
This is sort of his bit. And he's like, right, everybody is sort of committed into it and they don't want to release the ride. Now, that's a great big, that's like, reality is just a ride. It's like saying it's just a dream. Yeah, okay, so what? What do I do with that, right? It's like when people are arguing about, oh my God, could it be that we live in the Matrix? Right. Well, that's only relevant if it changes anything at all about my experience. It's relevant in the film because it allows him to dodge bullets and fly. If finding out that we're in a simulation allows me to dodge bullets and fly, I'll be thrilled. Right? But like, if it doesn't, then it's just a feature of physics. It's not important at all. The question around synchronicity, in my opinion, links to magic and links to these other kinds of examination because they gesture towards possibilities of being and self-transformation and ways of, in a sense, re-embedding ourselves in the world that are not currently addressed by our culture very well. And so, in a sense, it's a kind of golden shadow of the culture to go back and look at alchemy and look at this sort of discarded material and look at the ways that they were interacting with the world and see whether or not, basically how many babies we threw out with the bathwater. Yeah. Does that make sense?
It all makes sense. This has been such a fascinating tasting menu of so many different things that you have studied in detail. You brought up the comedian Bill Hicks. In today's conversation, I would say there's a quote from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia where he says, laughs are cheap, man. I'm going for gasps.
I'm going for gasps.
Yeah. You've gone for many gasps today. All of these topics have been super interesting, and each of these could be a separate lecture on its own, which you have put on your YouTube channel. So I highly encourage people who are interested to explore those even further. Let's start wrapping up. Before we go into the 3 closing questions, I would love to know what masterpiece you built with the Lego and what do you think I've built?
I started and then I got distracted.
Okay. What does it look like now, unfinished as it is?
I don't know. Like what is this? This is an unrealized Mondrian, maybe Mondrian painting. So I'll admit I was thrown because of the color distinctions. It's like there's only the 2 colors, and my brain was going stop and go. And then it was like, unless you're in China, in which case it's reversed. Then red is go and green is stop. Right. So my brain was kind of playing with like green. What do I do with green? Do I make a living thing? Then I was locked in here. And so I lost track of what you were building. May I?
Yeah, sure. Just don't break this masterpiece.
No, I won't. I like it. It looks to me like what? It looks to me like a kind of Dali-esque fire station.
That's exactly what I was going for. Look at that.
There you go.
I'm going to auction this, the Dali-esque fire station.
Yeah, crazy glue it, ship it on eBay. Or Etsy. Etsy, one Dali-esque fire station. I like it, though.
Keep an eye out for it. $15,000 starting bid. Let's go. Last 3 closing questions for you. Yeah. What are some books, movies, role models that have strongly inspired you? I'm looking for a list of recommendations.
There are certainly films that, inspired is a strong word. I like horror movies, and I find them to be both enjoyable and productive of insight, right? So my favorite film is
The Thing.
John Carpenter's The Thing. Yeah, 1982. That film it's perfect.
The 3 M's is satisfying.
Yeah, it's perfect, but it's not for everybody. right? If you have issues, if you get squicky, or if you have if the idea of somebody's head pulling off and then growing crab legs and running around is something you think you wouldn't like, that one's not for you.
That's my idea for rom-com.
Exactly. Well, no, the rom-com version is, of course, The Fly, Cronenberg, 1987. My second favorite film. And that film is also, it's gross. I mean, you're going to watch, you're going to watch the main like vomiting on donuts and pulling his ear off. It's grisly. It's Cronenberg. It's body horror. But also, without spoilers, I would propose that the whole thing, intentionally or not, is an alchemical narrative about the false conjunctio. So take that and run. Go watch the Cronenberg's 87 version of the thing and look at it as a false conjunctio. The whole thing's very alchemical. Okay. In terms of books, I mean, obviously, I'm going to recommend Jung. That sort of goes almost without saying. One of the books that probably had the deepest impact on me at a critical time was when I was 16. I read Gödel Bach by
Doug
Hofstadter. Yeah. And, that book is dated. Won the Pulitzer in 79, I think. So it's dated. It's 50 years old. But both the way that book playfully touches on things, the breadth of its interest, that was one of the first books that I remember encountering and thinking, yes, like this, like let us expand our realms of thought and see if we can make things rhyme or put them into relation, right? In a much more multidimensional, transdisciplinary kind of way. So Gödel Bach is a fantastic book. It's dated, take it with a grain of salt, but it's a fun read. Yeah, big influence on my writing and really on the scaffolding of interdisciplinary thinking, I think, in lots of ways. And I'm trying to think, can I throw in a music recommendation?
Of course.
I try at least once a year to listen to Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd as a religious experience.
Okay, that's a great list of recommendations.
Yeah.
What would you like your legacy to be? How do you want to be remembered?
Oh, God. Legacy. Honestly, when I was younger, I was more concerned with this kind of thing. Like what I would leave behind and so on. The more modest aim that I have come to is just like, I hope that on the balance, people feel more empowered and more themselves for having had contact with me than not. And I understand that's jagged, uneven territory. I, like all other human beings, am engaged in all sorts of ways and directions. But I guess I always hope that in both my therapeutic work and in my writing and I guess videos and whatever, even in the games that I run, that people are having an enriching experience where, that's of some use to them in their own journey. That is the comparatively low bar, I suppose, I set for myself. I'm not looking to overhaul a field. I don't need them to name a wing after me. I honestly don't expect to get that much attention. I think of myself as just a strange guy who's interested in things and happy to communicate those enthusiasms. But yeah, I mean, it is certainly gratifying. I've heard from a number of students and people online and so on and so forth about, the fact that they found it entertaining, but also in some way edifying or clarifying or even mind-blowing. I'll go for gasps. I'm not above gasps. So, yeah, that is, I suppose, the sole component of my legacy. But, I still have, with like a little luck, another few decades. So I don't really know where it's unfolding from there. It's very possible. It sort of feels like it's all coming together, but it's hard to judge those things in advance.
Well, this conversation has been quite enriching. So if we can extrapolate from this one sample set of one, I'm sure all your students and people who consume your content and who get to interact with you have also felt enriched after having conversations with you, learning more about your work. Final question.
Yeah.
You've studied the meaning thirst for a long time, thought about it. So I'm sure this is an easy question. You knock it out of the park. What is the meaning of life, Anderson Todd?
The meaning of life?
Of life, not in life.
Not in life. Okay.
Yeah.
Because that's a harder problem.
Exactly.
Okay. So not how do we specify the dimensions of meaning in life? That's an easier problem. What's the meaning of life? Okay. Short answer. I don't know. And I don't think anybody else does either. 1. 2, I'm fairly certain, I think Bernardo Castro put this very well when he said that it's absurd to think that the meaning of life is about us, like that the meaning of my life is about me. It's absurd as to think that the meaning or the purpose or something of the apple blossom is the apple blossom. The apple blossom is part of a process that goes from here to right. There is apple after it. There is bud before it. To zone in and clip something out and then be like, what is the apple blossom about? It's like it's part of a process. And I think that applies to us too. We're part of something bigger than ourselves. We're part of an overall process. I think the meaning of life, at some sense, this is a trite early 21st century, but we are the universe observing itself. And so at some level, I think that our meaning, our purpose is in finding ourselves in that paradoxical relationship, that we are simultaneously embedded in the world and separated from it, that we are connected to other people and internalize other people and yet are distinct from them. And so there's something really fundamental in this tension. And to me, the meaning of life is in embracing the paradox and maybe thereby synthesizing a form of awareness which exceeds that in some way.
Embrace the paradox. Anderson, if people wish to connect with you, find out more about you, your work, watch your videos, or just know more in general, how do they find you, connect with you?
I would say the easiest method would just be my YouTube channel, because it's open and it's publicly facing. So if you want to share the link for that, I don't know, it's Anderson. Is it Anderson Todd or is it Anderson R. Todd? My middle name is Robert. My initials are Art.
Okay.
So it's fine with me. Yeah, but if you search me up on YouTube, Anderson Todd,
link it.
Anderson Todd Therapy, Anderson Todd Toronto, Anderson Todd Jung, I'm sure any of those would turn it up. I think if you look there, you would also find my Gmail address, which is where I handle sort of professional communications. And I'm just in the process of relocating my home. But one of the projects that I do have in mind for after the dust is settled is finally overhauling and posting up a website. So possibly by the time somebody looks, there will be a website, but there isn't now. YouTube is the answer.
Anderson, we've gone nearly 3 hours.
Oh, shit.
And this has been, shit is the answer, but this has been a true honor and a privilege for me. Thank you so much.
I enjoyed it as well. So thank you very much. And yeah, I should have you on my side, or if you want to do this again, I'd be happy to. I didn't realize that was 3 hours. So that's a good sign, I think.
This is no time. If you liked what you just watched or listened to, then please consider supporting this project. You can subscribe on YouTube, follow on Spotify, rate 5 stars in Apple Podcasts. This project is a labor of love, but it just cannot survive on love alone. I'm honestly at a crossroads with this project. For the longest amount of time, I had resisted getting sponsors on the show. I just felt slightly disingenuous. But I've reached a stage where this donor model is just not sustainable. But I want to give it one last shot. So if you think this project is of value, these conversations are of value, then please consider supporting this project. You can join as a donor on Patreon. You can join as a YouTube member. You can buy super thanks on individual videos. Or you can buy merch from the newly launched merch shop. There's a high cost of production for these conversations, and they don't get pushed by the algorithm. It doesn't care about 2-hour discussions about rationality or laws of nature, quantum computing, or Jungian psychology. It prefers pushing more memes, clickbait content, wild content, gossip that will get shared around more often, because that's what it ranks high in relevance. So if you want to see this continue, please consider making a monetary donation that could be as low as $1 a month, the cost of coffee a month, or the cost of a subway ticket, and I will be your bestie for life. If not through monetary channels, then do consider sharing these episodes around. Your external links and clicks and shares, man, they go a long way. It's gold dust to push these videos past the barriers that are set by the algorithm. So please consider sharing it around. It's a no-cost way of supporting this project. Otherwise, you can always follow this channel on Instagram or Twitter, or follow me personally.